Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, the quiet little corner where curiosity settles in beside you, where science loosens its collar and takes its time, and where the questions that follow us through the day become softer as the night grows still. Tonight we're drifting into a mystery that has been waiting under our feet for longer than recorded memory. A question so large that it stretches through buried cities, forgotten coastlines, and the faintest hints of worlds that once thrived and then slipped beyond our reach. We're going to wander through the possibility that Earth may have hosted more civilizations than the ones we already know. Cultures that rose, lived entire histories, and vanished so completely that all we have left is the quiet suggestion that something might have happened here long before anyone was around to write it down. Before we begin easing into that landscape, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're in a room that feels comfortably familiar, or in a place that's new to you. Maybe it's late. Maybe you're just winding down. Maybe you're already on the edge of sleep. Whatever moment you've arrived from, I'm glad you're here. If this gentle exploration brings you a little calm or curiosity, or simply keeps you company, I'd be grateful if you like the video or subscribe to this peaceful space. It helps others find their way here when they need something quiet to fall into. Now as you settle in and let the pace slow, imagine for a moment the ground beneath you not as a solid, silent surface, but as a layered archive of everything that Earth has ever held. Not in a dramatic way, but in the simple geological truth that the soil beneath us is older than any story we tell. It keeps its memories differently from us. Instead of words or art or monuments that stand openly under the sun, the planet stores its past in sediments, in eroded ruins, in faint chemical traces, in shifts in rock that only make sense when someone looks closely enough. And those layers have their own quiet language, one that suggests that there may have been more to human history, and perhaps even pre-human history, than the fragments we usually hear about. When most of us think about lost civilizations, our minds turn to the ones we already know were real. Places like the Maya with their intricate writing and astronomically aligned temples. The people of Mesopotamia building cities out of clay long before most of the world thought in terms of cities at all. The early cultures along the Indus River whose writing we still haven't deciphered. Entire worlds existed, and entire worlds disappeared. But the question we're visiting tonight asks something a little broader than the well-documented stories carved into stone or fired into tablets. It wonders whether some civilizations existed without leaving clear evidence in the familiar forms we expect, whether the Earth itself remembers societies that we so far have not. When archaeologists study a known ancient city, the evidence is often direct. Walls still shaped by human hands, pottery fired in kilns, bones arranged with intention, tools that carry unmistakable signs of craft. But what about the eras where time washed those signs clean, or where rising seas covered whole regions before anyone could record their existence? The Earth's natural processes are astonishingly good at swallowing entire landscapes. Coastlines move, rivers shift, mountains rise slowly while oceans erase their edges. If a culture thrived 10,000 years ago along a shoreline that is now 100 meters underwater, its traces may be scattered so widely or buried so deeply that recognizing them becomes a challenge. Not impossible, but certainly difficult. This brings us to the stories the soil still whispers, the ones that don't arrive in the neat shapes we expect. Instead, they appear as anomalies, patterns that look slightly too intentional, layers of rock that seem disturbed in unusual ways, old floodplains where something seems to have been built and then taken apart by time until only its faint outline remains. These don't prove anything on their own, but they nudge at our curiosity. They remind us that human civilizations we know of have collapsed and been forgotten before, and that earlier societies may have vanished so completely that we only catch glimpses of them through geological hints rather than physical ruins. Consider how much we've lost even from cultures we absolutely know existed. For example, the Indus Valley civilization had enormous cities with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized bricks, and trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, yet we still don't know what their writing means. Without deciphering it, their beliefs, myths, and daily rhythms remain silent. If a major civilization that existed barely 5,000 years ago can leave behind a mystery this large, imagine how much more could disappear over tens of thousands of years or under catastrophic environmental shifts. One of the reasons older civilizations are harder to detect is the sheer pressure of time. Erosion, heat, water, biological activity, and geological cycles all gradually erase the signs of human presence. Modern structures wouldn't last long on geological timescales. Even skyscrapers made of reinforced concrete would crumble in a matter of tens of thousands of years. In 100,000 years, almost nothing recognizable would remain on the surface. In 1,000,000 years, nearly all traces would be gone. That means if any earlier civilizations existed far before our current timeline suggests, the planet would have had more than enough time to cover their footprints. This doesn't mean there were advanced civilizations millions of years ago. There's no evidence suggesting technologically complex societies that early, and mainstream science places human emergence much later. But the idea we're exploring tonight isn't about making extraordinary claims. It's about acknowledging how little of Earth's full history we actually have access to, and how easy it is for entire cultures to slip away without leaving clear artifacts. Take the example of Gbekli Tepe, a site in southeastern Turkey that rewrote enormous parts of our understanding of early societies. For decades, archaeologists believed that organized religion, monumental architecture, and large-scale gathering places could only arise after agriculture produced surplus resources. Then Göbekli Tepe appeared, older than any known city, older than pottery, older than domesticated crops. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with animals and symbols, built by people who weren't supposed to build things like this that early. And this site lay buried for thousands of years, invisible until someone started digging in the 1990s. Its existence didn't come from myths or gradual speculation. It came from dirt being gently brushed aside until the past revealed something entirely unexpected. If a structure that large and significant remained hidden for so long, consider how many smaller or more fragile ones still lie undiscovered. Not because people aren't looking, but because Earth is vast, and erosion and climate change shape it continuously. Coastlines where people may once have lived are now underwater due to rising seas after the last ice age. Entire valleys are filled with sediments deposited over millennia. Deserts have swallowed once fertile regions. Rainforests hide landscapes under dense vegetation. All this means the past is not simply lost. It is hidden in ways that require patience, technology, and sometimes luck to uncover. Sonar mapping reveals hints of old structures beneath shallow waters. Ground-penetrating radar finds straight lines where nature rarely makes them. Ancient pollen trapped in lake sediment tells stories of landscapes shaped by human hands far earlier than we once assumed. Even charcoal deposits in unexpected patterns indicate controlled burning at times and places that challenge our timelines. These are not proofs of forgotten civilizations. They are reminders that history is patchy. Records of fire, stone, and seed remain long after stories disappear, and the soil keeps those quiet details until someone notices something that doesn't quite fit the familiar narrative. This pattern repeats across continents. In South America, the Amazon rainforest was long assumed to be a pristine wilderness, untouched by large-scale human settlement, until researchers discovered vast geometric earthworks beneath the trees. Highly organised, carefully constructed shapes that required planning and collaborative labour, hidden until deforestation made them visible from photographs taken above the canopy. No advanced technology was involved, but a large and organised culture had lived there, shaped the land, and then vanished long before modern eyes could recognise their work. Similarly, in Africa, there are regions where the soil carries evidence of ancient farming systems far older and more intricate than once believed. Terraces carved into hillsides, forgotten irrigation methods, and settlement patterns that suggest large, stable communities that thrived long before widely known civilizations emerged. Again, we're not dealing with lost technologies or mythical empires, simply cultural achievements that faded away as populations moved, climates changed, or societies reorganized. And perhaps that's the most important part of the story. Civilizations do not need to vanish through disaster or mystery. Sometimes they simply transition into something else, leaving behind structures that crumble, languages that shift, and memories that blend into legend. When enough time passes, even well-established societies can be forgotten. When anthropology students look at the disappearance of the Nabateans, the builders of Petra, they see how quickly a vibrant culture can fade once its economic foundations collapse. The lesson isn't that Petra was swallowed by myth. It's that people move on, but stone remains, and even stone eventually falls. So when we ask how many civilizations Earth may have forgotten, we're not necessarily imagining lost technologies or hidden empires. We're acknowledging that humanity's story is far older and more complex than what survives in textbooks. Most of the humans who ever lived left no records. They shaped landscapes, developed traditions, and built communities that made perfect sense within their own time. But not every culture chooses monuments, durable materials, or extensive writing. Many leave almost nothing except faint changes in soil chemistry or the way a forest grows back after cultivation. And through all of these scattered clues, the soil keeps whispering that there is more to learn. Not in a dramatic or mysterious way, but in the simple acknowledgement that Earth has held countless lives and countless stories. When researchers sift through sediments that date back 40,000 years and find evidence of controlled fire use, organised hunting strategies, or traces of pigments that may have been used for art, they're seeing fragments of societies that were capable, thoughtful and creative long before written records appeared. These communities had their own rhythms, beliefs and skills, yet most of their existence remains beyond our reach, because time preserved only small hints. As we keep moving through this exploration, the question turns from whether forgotten civilizations existed to how we define the word civilization itself. Some cultures build cities, others remain nomadic. Some carve tales into stone, others pass them down through memory. Some leave pottery and architecture behind, others live in ways that let the landscape reclaim everything quickly. A civilization doesn't need to be large or technologically advanced to be significant. It only needs to be a society that shaped its world in ways meaningful to the people living in it. And Earth, being as old and changeable as it is, has room for many more such worlds than we currently acknowledge. The soil beneath us hasn't forgotten them. It just speaks slowly, in small discoveries, in unexpected findings that hint at stories we haven't pieced together yet. And as researchers continue to study those traces, new possibilities appear not as bold declarations, but as gentle reminders of how much of human history remains hidden, waiting for someone to notice its quiet presence. When we think about history, it's tempting to picture it as a single clean line, something that moves neatly from one era to the next, with each new society rising directly from the remains of the one before it. But the Earth doesn't arrange things that neatly. It allows cultures to come and go in ways that don't always connect to the stories we're familiar with. Some communities grow for centuries and then reorganize into different forms. Others expand quickly, flourish through remarkable ingenuity, and then fade without leaving the kind of durable reminders that later generations expect to find. This means the world has seen far more variety in human experience than any standard timeline can comfortably make room for. When you picture a civilization rising, there is often an image of monumental buildings and organized cities, but the truth is that growth doesn't always look like that. Some societies flourished by mastering landscapes rather than constructing them. They shaped river paths, developed seasonal migrations, or created agricultural systems that left almost no structural footprint. These worlds thrived in ways suited to their environments. and because their success did not depend on stone walls or intricate monuments, the signs of their existence blended back into the surroundings as time moved forward. While some cultures left towering ruins that still catch the eye, others left behind patterns so subtle that researchers only recognize them through careful measurement of soil layers or through the distribution of ancient seeds. When archaeologists uncover a region where forests show unusually uniform regrowth, it suggests someone cultivated that land for generations. Entire communities may have lived there and flourished, yet not one building needs to survive for that memory to remain embedded in the ground. And in many cases, these subtle signatures are older than civilizations that left far more dramatic evidence. This becomes clear when we examine the long span of human prehistory. Our species has existed for hundreds of thousands of years, but most of what we call history focuses on the last few thousand, simply because written records didn't exist earlier, or they didn't last. Yet people before writing were as capable of ingenuity as anyone living later. They adapted, created tools, planned migrations, traded goods, and organized themselves in ways that met their needs. Some of these worlds grew large and stable enough that researchers now believe they might have been more structured than previously assumed. And while they may not have built skyscrapers or machines, they still shaped their landscapes in ways that required coordinated effort, shared knowledge, and stable social structures. The problem is that such societies vanish easily. Wood rots, clay breaks, textiles dissolve, bones scatter, and if people move on or reorganize their lives due to climate changes, the traces they leave behind blend into natural layers until the distinction between human activity and environmental patterns becomes difficult to separate. One example of this complexity appears along ancient coastlines. When the last glacial period ended, melting ice caused sea levels to rise dramatically. Entire coastal plains were swallowed by the ocean. These regions had been ideal for human habitation, offering fertile soil, abundant fresh water, and access to marine resources. If large, stable communities lived there, and it's reasonable to think many did, their remains now lie beneath tens of meters of water. Underwater exploration has revealed small hints of structures and tool deposits in some areas, but systematic study is challenging. The ocean floor is vast and constantly shifting. Sediments cover everything quickly. In many places, underwater archaeology is still in its early stages, meaning that countless potential discoveries remain hidden. Even when something is found, it might not look impressive. A single stone arrangement, a cluster of tools, or unusual carving marks are often all that survive. And without a larger context, even archaeologists must be cautious about drawing conclusions. Yet each discovery reinforces the idea that our timeline is incomplete. It's not wrong, but it is far from finished. Another region that continues to change our understanding is the Sahara. Today, it's one of the largest deserts on Earth, but thousands of years ago it was far greener. Lakes dotted the landscape, rivers flowed freely, vegetation supported wildlife that now belongs to distant ecosystems, and where water flows, people follow. They build communities, develop trade routes, and map their lives according to seasons. Stone tools and pottery fragments have been found across the Sahara at scales large enough to indicate widespread human activity, but without the preservation power of consistent moisture or stable soil, much of that world is gone. Wind erases what remains, sand buries artifacts, heat breaks down organic material. A society that may have lasted for centuries can disappear not because it was small or unimportant, but because the climate shifted and erased the evidence. There are also examples of societies that flourished in regions where nature constantly reclaims its space. The dense forests of Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Oceania hold landscapes where humidity, vegetation, and microbial activity break down everything at astonishing speed. Wood-based structures might last only a few decades after abandonment. Metal corrodes quickly. Pathways become overgrown. What might have been a bustling network of communities can become indistinguishable from the surrounding environment in less than a century. The Amazon example illustrates this perfectly, but similar scenarios exist in many parts of the world. The fact that they haven't been fully studied doesn't mean they never existed. When historians examine places where civilizations vanished, they often find patterns in why these disappearances occur. Environmental shifts are among the most common reasons. A steady change in rainfall patterns, a river altering its course, or soil losing its fertility can push societies to relocate. Such moves don't always leave behind dramatic physical evidence. People simply adapt and build new lives elsewhere, sometimes taking their knowledge with them, sometimes reinventing themselves in ways that disconnect their future identity from their past. There are countless examples of this kind of transformation. The people who built the earliest known agricultural systems in what is now the Sahel region developed methods for managing water and soil that were sophisticated for their time. Yet we still don't know much about their beliefs or social structures. They lived, they planned, they flourished, and eventually they changed their way of life. The traces they left weren't enough to anchor them in the public imagination, but they were enough to show researchers that farming traditions far older than expected shaped the region. In Europe, there are regions where the soil holds signs of human settlement thousands of years before written records, but those settlements didn't produce the kinds of lasting ruins that define later civilizations. People built with organic materials, moved in response to seasonal changes, and lived in ways that left behind faint outlines of post holes, fire pits, or spatial organisation that only appears when someone digs deeply enough and reads the patterns with care. Even societies that produce durable structures can fade into silence. There are stone-built communities in Central Asia and Eastern Europe that were once thriving centres of trade. Their walls and foundations still exist, but the people who lived in them left no surviving written records, and their languages remain unknown. Without texts or continuous traditions, their stories become fragmented. Researchers know they existed, but beyond broad understandings of their economies or migration patterns, the details of their lives remain out of reach. Then there are the truly puzzling cases where something larger may have occurred, but the evidence is thin enough that it leaves room only for cautious speculation. Across South Asia, layers of settlement beneath known ancient cities sometimes reveal older structures arranged with surprising precision. These hints don't verify the existence of unknown civilizations, but they do show that earlier groups built in ways that required organization and planning. In some layers, there are signs of shared architectural styles that don't match known cultures, suggesting networks of communication or shared traditions that haven't been fully reconstructed. One of the most intriguing ideas raised by researchers studying these patterns is that human complexity doesn't always appear as a sudden jump. Instead, it may rise, settle, rise again, and shift many times across different regions without leaving the kind of unified cultural signature that later eras display. This means Earth may have hosted numerous societies that achieved impressive stability and innovation, yet because they didn't build in durable materials or record their languages in lasting forms, they faded so completely that only soil chemistry or faint structural remains indicate they were ever there. When discussing these forgotten worlds, it's important to avoid imagining them as advanced in ways that conflict with established scientific evidence. There is no support for hyper-technological civilizations in deep prehistory. Instead, the focus is on cultures that may have been more socially complex than we once assumed. The Earth is old, and humans have been capable and adaptive for far longer than a narrow timeline would suggest. If early groups organised themselves into thriving communities, they would have created cultural worlds rich in meaning for the people living in them. They would have had rituals, traditions, knowledge systems, and perhaps even networks of exchange that connected groups across significant distances. Even if these aspects left few visible traces, they would still represent flourishing societies. Many of these worlds fell into silence not because they collapsed dramatically, but because of gradual processes that make human traces vulnerable. A settlement, that shifts slightly over generations may leave behind so little that future archaeologists can barely identify its boundaries. Floods spread sediments over entire regions. Wind and rain reshape landscapes. Plants grow, decay, and integrate into the very soil that once supported human activity. And when enough time passes, those subtle signs become indistinguishable from natural patterns unless someone is specifically looking for them. Another reason civilizations fade involves the fragility of collective memory. Oral traditions can preserve history for astonishing spans of time, but even they have limits. Stories evolve with each generation. Meanings shift. Practical details are replaced with symbolic ones. Eventually, the historical foundation becomes so faint that what remains is more cultural memory than factual record. And when those memories lose their anchoring, entire civilizations can drift into myth or vanish entirely from living traditions. This is why archaeological work sometimes reveals worlds that were never mentioned in the myths of the people living nearby. The memories didn't survive, not because anyone tried to erase them, but because they weren't tied to physical structures or written forms that could reinforce them. As people moved, adapted, and created new cultural frameworks, older stories were simply absorbed into broader traditions or replaced by new narratives that fit changing circumstances. Even civilizations that left behind extraordinary structures can disappear almost completely if they don't remain continuously occupied. Consider how quickly a large city can become uninhabitable after abandonment. Within decades, nature reclaims structures. Trees crack foundations. Water fills lower levels. Wildlife moves in. Without maintenance, even durable buildings degrade. Within centuries, much of the original shape is lost, and over millennia even stone can erode into unrecognizable fragments. All of this reminds us that civilizations do not need to be small or obscure to vanish. They only need enough time without preservation or transmission of knowledge. And Earth has had far more time than most people realize for such cycles to occur. The soil, rock formations, and shifting coastlines act as a quiet record of these cycles. They show where fires burned regularly enough to suggest human maintenance. They show where plants grew in unnatural concentrations. They show where rivers were rerouted in ways that don't match natural patterns. These patterns show not just that civilizations rose, but that they thrived. They had stable ways of living, shared resources, and shaped their landscapes in distinctive ways. Some lasted long enough to influence neighbouring groups. Others remained isolated due to geography, climate, or cultural choice. And eventually, each one found itself in a situation where change became necessary. Sometimes that change meant growth. Other times it meant dispersal. And with dispersal comes silence, not in a dramatic sense, but in the slow fading of identifiable evidence. It becomes clearer that Earth is not simply a container for a few well-known civilizations. It is a place where countless worlds rose, lived full lives, contributed to the long story of humanity, and then stepped quietly into the background as new ones emerged. The silence they left is not empty. It's filled with the potential to learn more as tools improve, as researchers examine the ground with new methods, and as our understanding of human complexity expands beyond the narrow view once assumed. When researchers try to understand civilizations that disappeared long before anyone could document them, they often find themselves working within a strange kind of puzzle. Instead of assembling pieces that clearly belong to a known picture, they must learn to notice the absence of things. They interpret patterns where material evidence is thin or scattered. They read the landscape in ways that resemble learning a language without having any examples of full sentences. This approach, sometimes called working with negative evidence, is one of the most challenging aspects of archaeology because it requires careful reasoning rather than immediate conclusions, and it becomes even more important when studying societies that did not leave behind durable structures or written records. The idea of absence might sound like a lack of information, but in practice, it provides a surprising amount of insight. When a region contains no structures yet shows signs that large groups once lived there, The missing pieces prompt researchers to ask why those materials didn't survive. Did people use materials that decay quickly? Did they move often? Did their settlements lie in places prone to erosion? Or did environmental shifts remove what they built? The answers vary from place to place, and each possibility shapes the picture of who once lived there. Consider a landscape that appears untouched on the surface. To a casual observer, it might look like land that was never settled, but when researchers take soil samples, they may find evidence of controlled fires, or chemical residues from long-term human habitation, or patterns in pollen layers that indicate ancient farming. These signs can be small enough that someone without archaeological training would walk past them without noticing anything unusual. Yet to specialists, such traces suggest that entire communities lived and worked in that area, leaving behind nothing that stands visibly above the ground. This is the archaeology of absence at work, relying on subtle changes rather than obvious artifacts. A striking example of this method appears in landscapes once used for agriculture, long before formal records existed. When ancient farmers cleared land, tilled soil, or grew crops repeatedly over generations, the soil structure changed in ways distinguishable from untouched regions. Even without tools, pottery, or buildings, the earth itself holds the signature of human activity. It may contain more of certain nutrients, fewer of others, or a distribution of microscopic remains that reflect past cultivation. These patterns show where people once invested time and effort into shaping the land, even if everything they built has long since vanished. One of the most intriguing aspects of this work is how much it depends on what is missing. In many regions, researchers expect to find certain types of artifacts if a society reached a particular level of complexity. If those artifacts aren't present, it raises questions. Did the society use different materials? Did they organize themselves in a way that does not match traditional expectations? Or did environmental forces erase their artifacts before they could fossilize or survive as recognizable remains? Each missing element shapes the interpretation, encouraging researchers to consider alternatives to the standard model of how civilizations form. This type of investigation is particularly valuable in regions dominated by natural processes that erase evidence quickly. In tropical environments, organic material decomposes rapidly. In deserts, wind abrasion strips surfaces clean. In floodplains, rising water can bury or wash away everything above a certain depth. If a society built primarily with wood, plant fibres or earth, its settlements might leave only faint traces at best. And yet people lived meaningful, organised lives in these regions. They made decisions, formed traditions, and influenced generations that came after them, even if the physical record struggles to reflect their presence. Another example comes from regions where people constructed temporary or portable dwellings. Societies that moved seasonally for hunting, herding, or trade often left scattered marks rather than permanent architecture. These marks might include hearths, tool fragments, animal remains showing butchering patterns, or compacted ground where many people once walked. To someone studying the land from a distance, these signs may seem isolated and unconnected, but once assembled carefully, they can reveal migration routes, seasonal cycles, and long-term settlement patterns that continued for centuries. The absence of monumental structures in such cultures does not indicate a lack of sophistication, only a different way of living. The archaeology of absence also becomes essential when studying societies that interacted with their environment in ways that blended their impact with natural processes. For example, controlled burning practices used to manage forests or grasslands can leave traces in sediment layers. The frequency and distribution of ancient charcoal can distinguish human-set fires from natural wildfires. If a region shows centuries of regular, low-intensity burning, it suggests deliberate land management rather than random natural events. These patterns imply planning, knowledge of local ecology, and communal decision-making, even when no buildings remain. There are also landscapes where absence raises questions about what once stood there. Sometimes researchers find platforms, foundations, or levelled areas that suggest construction, but the materials used were removed, repurposed, or decayed entirely. In these cases, the shape of the land becomes the artefact. A flat terrace carved into a hillside may indicate agricultural practices or settlement areas. A circular depression might mark where a structure once existed. These impressions reveal the outlines of past worlds without showing their physical details. They encourage researchers to interpret what the missing materials might have been, and how the people who lived there adapted their surroundings. Another scenario arises when a site contains artifacts, but lacks the diversity expected for a large population. If only certain types of tools remain, or if pottery fragments are found without corresponding signs of dwellings, it could mean that organic or fragile materials form the primary construction methods. It could also indicate cultural practices that didn't emphasize durable goods. For example, nomadic societies may have used animal hides, woven mats, wooden poles, or other items that do not survive long after abandonment. The absence of structures in such cases reflects mobility and lifestyle, rather than a lack of civilization. The archaeology of absence also intersects with the challenges of understanding how climate changes reshape the archaeological record. Flood cycles can destroy settlements repeatedly. Volcanic eruptions can bury entire communities under layers of ash. Shifting river systems can cut through old sites, scatter artifacts, or create new floodplains. Over long enough periods, these processes can remove almost all visible evidence of past habitation, leaving behind only the most durable items. And since durable items do not always reflect the full range of activities or social structures, the resulting picture is incomplete. Researchers must then interpret what is missing rather than what remains. In some cases, absence challenges assumptions about how early societies lived. For example, it was once believed that large-scale settlements always required permanent architecture, but studies of certain prehistoric groups show that stable populations can thrive using temporary structures if the surrounding environment provides reliable resources. This means the lack of permanent buildings does not automatically signal a small or loosely organised community. Instead, it may reflect a flexible way of life shaped by climate, seasonality, or cultural preference. Recognizing this helps researchers avoid underestimating the complexity of societies that built lightly on the land. Another dimension of this work involves studying what natural processes would be expected to preserve. When the expected patterns do not match the actual findings, it suggests human influence. For example, certain animal bones might appear in unusually dense concentrations in regions where natural predators are unlikely to create such patterns. If these bones show cut marks or consistent breaks associated with human consumption, they indicate butchering practices even when no tools or structures remain nearby. The absence of tools doesn't negate the evidence of human presence. It merely means tools were made from materials that did not survive. Similarly, when ancient pollen layers shift suddenly from wild plant varieties to species associated with cultivation, it signals farming activities. The absence of agricultural tools might encourage deeper investigation into what materials were used, whether fields were temporary or permanent, and how people managed their crops. Researchers build entire models of ancient agriculture based on such evidence, showing how societies may have organised themselves without ever leaving a single piece of pottery or architecture. This approach is vital for revisiting assumptions about the timeline of human development. Many older archaeological theories assume that complex societies emerged only after the invention of certain technologies or structural forms. But the archaeology of absence shows that technological or architectural evidence does not always survive, especially in regions where environmental conditions work against preservation. As a result, researchers now recognise that social complexity may have appeared much earlier and in more diverse forms than previously believed. The lack of evidence does not imply a lack of development. It often implies a lack of preservation. Working with absence requires a careful balance between interpretation and restraint. Archaeologists must avoid drawing conclusions beyond what the evidence can support. while also avoiding the opposite mistake of assuming nothing existed simply because nothing survives. This balance allows them to reconstruct realistic possibilities about how past societies lived. The goal is not to fill every gap, but to understand how those gaps formed and what they imply about the people who once occupied those spaces. This methodology becomes particularly useful when studying regions that have experienced repeated cycles of habitation and abandonment. Some areas show layers of occupation separated by long intervals where little activity occurred. The absence of artifacts in these gaps helps establish timelines, showing how climate fluctuations, resource availability, or migration patterns shaped human movement. When combined with evidence from surrounding regions, these absences reveal broader social and environmental dynamics. Another important aspect involves recognizing the limits of current technology. Techniques like ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and sediment analysis allow researchers to detect hidden structures or land modifications. But even these tools cannot reveal everything. Some sites remain inaccessible due to depth, geological activity, or modern development. Others lie underwater in places where detailed exploration is difficult. As technology improves, some of these absences will eventually yield new information. But until then, researchers work with the gaps to build cautious interpretations of what might have been. The archaeology of absence also teaches us something important about how fragile evidence can be. A single generation of environmental disruption can erase centuries of human activity. Floods can wash away villages. Storms can remove surface artifacts. Fires can clear entire layers of occupation. Without durable materials or continuous human presence to maintain structures, even thriving societies can disappear from the record in a surprisingly short time. This understanding encourages researchers to look more deeply into regions previously dismissed as uninhabited, revealing worlds that once existed but left only faint impressions. As we continue exploring how Earth has held more histories than the surface reveals, this approach becomes essential. The past is not defined solely by what remains. It is also shaped by what has been removed, altered, or overwritten by natural forces. Some societies built in ways that blended perfectly with their surroundings. Others adapted their lives to shifting conditions, leaving only subtle traces behind. These absences are part of their legacy, reminding us that human history is not a neat progression, but a mosaic with pieces missing in patterns that still convey meaning. When we picture ancient cities, certain familiar examples tend to come to mind because they left behind structures that are easy to recognize. Their stones remained in place for centuries. Their walls held shape long enough for archaeologists to document them. Their artifacts survived in ways that allow us to imagine how people once lived. But these known sites represent only a small portion of the urban worlds that ever existed. Many more cities are suspected based on fragmented clues, uneven evidence, or scattered remnants that do not yet fit into a complete story. Some lie beneath thick layers of sediment, others remain hidden under forests or oceans, and still others may have existed in forms that leave almost no architectural signature at all. The cities we know are the ones that left enough behind to anchor themselves in the visible past. There are places where stone walls still stand in clear outlines. Streets remain aligned in ways that reflect the choices of long-gone planners. Public spaces, storage areas, workshops, and dwellings remain distinct enough that researchers can map them with confidence. These cities appear in textbooks because they were built to last. They relied on materials and construction methods that endure environmental change better than wood, clay, plant fibers, or earth-based structures. Even when abandoned, they retained enough physical form to survive erosion for millennia. But the durability of stone is not the only reason these cities remain known. Many were located in regions where climate preserved their remains. Dry environments, for example, protect artifacts and structures exceptionally well. Some of the most detailed archaeological sites exist in deserts because the lack of moisture slows decay dramatically. This gives certain regions an advantage in preserving traces of the past, even though they represent only a fraction of the world's ancient societies. Meanwhile, places with heavy rainfall, shifting soil, seasonal flooding, or dense vegetation rarely preserve settlements in recognisable form. Entire cities in such regions can disappear quickly, even if they once held thousands of people. When archaeologists explore areas where known cities stood, they often find layers of habitation stacked beneath the visible remains. These layers reveal earlier iterations of the same settlement or evidence of entirely different communities that lived there long before. This stratification shows that urban life was not limited to the best-known eras. Instead, many places saw cycles of growth, decline, abandonment, and renewal. Some early cities left only faint traces beneath later construction, making it difficult to determine how complex those earlier phases were. What remains visible on the surface might represent only the final version of a city that evolved through many forms. Then there are the cities we only suspect. These are places where clues appear, but not enough to declare certainty. Sometimes the hints are structural. Satellite images might show faint geometric patterns beneath vegetation, or unusual soil discoloration might outline a grid-like arrangement. In other cases, the clues are environmental. Evidence of sustained agricultural activity might indicate a nearby settlement large enough to qualify as a city. Irrigation systems, terracing, or large-scale land modifications often imply coordinated labour, which usually supports population centres. But if the city itself was built with perishable materials, it may leave behind little more than modified terrain. One of the clearest examples of suspected cities appears in regions where rivers have changed course repeatedly over thousands of years. Rivers both support and destroy settlements. They offer water, transportation, and fertile soil, but they can also flood unpredictably, erode foundations, or bury communities under layers of silt. In these zones, archaeologists sometimes find evidence of straight lines or regular shapes deep in the ground, arranged in ways that do not match natural features. These signs suggest the remains of buildings, roads, or defensive structures. Yet without excavating wide areas, confirming these patterns is difficult. And in regions where modern populations now live, large-scale excavation may not be feasible. Another category of suspected cities involves places where artifacts appear in quantities that suggest dense population, yet physical structures are absent. Pottery fragments, tools, beads, or food remains concentrated in a specific region imply long-term habitation. If these items appear repeatedly across large areas, they may indicate a settlement pattern consistent with urban life. However, unless foundations or durable walls are found, researchers must interpret such findings cautiously. A high density of artifacts might reflect seasonal gatherings, trade centres, or ritual sites rather than permanent cities. There are regions where natural disasters erase entire settlements. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, and landslides can remove urban structures with remarkable speed. In some cases, layers of ash perfectly preserve buildings beneath them, as seen in well-known sites. But in many other cases, destructive forces leave little behind. Floodwaters can redistribute materials so thoroughly that distinguishing human-made structures becomes nearly impossible. If a city once stood in such a region, the absence of recognisable remains does not indicate it was small or insignificant. It simply means the circumstances of its destruction were too severe for typical archaeological signatures to survive. Coastal regions present similar challenges. After the last ice age ended, sea levels rose significantly, submerging coastlines where ancient settlements once stood. Because many early societies depended on coastal resources, it is likely that entire cities now lie beneath the ocean. Underwater archaeological surveys have uncovered walls, roads, and cultural artifacts in several locations, but the vast majority of underwater landscapes remain unexplored. Visibility underwater is limited. Sediments shift frequently. Mapping submerged sites requires specialized equipment. As a result, only a small fraction of potential coastal settlements has been studied in detail, leaving countless possibilities unresolved. Another category of suspected cities emerges from large earthworks found in regions where stone was not used extensively. Some societies built with packed earth, timber, or other materials that degrade quickly. The only remaining evidence might be raised mounds, depressions, or broad elevated platforms. These earthworks can cover vast areas, sometimes stretching for kilometres. Their size and arrangement suggest planning, organisation, and communal labour. They often reflect the movement of soil on a scale that requires coordination comparable to urban development. Yet because no visible structures remain, it can be difficult to determine whether these areas were cities, ceremonial centres, residential complexes, or a mixture of several functions. When researchers identify such earthworks, they often use technologies like LIDAR to reveal patterns hidden beneath vegetation. LIDAR's ability to detect ground contours allows archaeologists to see geometric shapes obscured by trees or soil. In some regions, LIDAR surveys have revealed entire landscapes filled with previously unknown structures. Roads extend for miles. Plazas and platforms align with patterns consistent with urban planning. These discoveries suggest that the cities we know represent only a portion of the ancient world's urban history. Many societies built in ways that did not leave durable ruins, yet still created organised, complex settlements. This raises an important point about how we define a city. Traditionally, the term implies permanent buildings, clear boundaries, and structures that survive long enough to be recognised. But not all cultures built cities with those priorities. Some placed greater emphasis on mobility, seasonal rhythms, or construction methods suited to their environment. Others used community organisation rather than permanent architecture as their central feature. If a society built structures designed to be moved, replaced, or renewed frequently, then little would remain after thousands of years. Yet such a society could still possess all the characteristics associated with urban life: population density, specialised labour, social hierarchy, and sustained cultural practices. Another challenge arises from the variety of ways cities collapse. Some decline gradually as populations move elsewhere. Others contract into smaller settlements before eventually dissolving completely. Still others are abandoned abruptly, leaving behind a snapshot of daily life. Each pattern of abandonment creates a different archaeological signature. When a city declines slowly, structures may fall apart piece by piece, making them harder to identify later. When a city collapses suddenly, more artifacts may remain intact. The differences between these patterns influence what researchers can detect thousands of years later. In many regions, suspected cities are identified not through direct remains, but through patterns of resource distribution. If a large number of quarries, mines, or farming areas all point toward a central location, it suggests that a population centre once coordinated those activities. Similarly, trade networks can indicate urban hubs. When artifacts from distant places appear repeatedly in a single region, it implies the existence of a marketplace or administrative centre. These clues point towards cities even when no structural remains are found. There are also cases where legends or oral histories hint at ancient cities that have not yet been located archaeologically. While stories cannot be taken as definitive evidence, they often guide researchers toward regions worth investigating. In several instances, what began as a traditional story eventually led to discoveries that confirm the existence of once-forgotten settlements. These stories sometimes describe locations that are now underwater, buried beneath volcanic deposits, or covered by modern development. Archaeology in such areas requires patience, as well as the understanding that the evidence may be extremely fragmented. Some suspected cities reflect older phases of known urban centres. When excavations reveal deep layers beneath established sites, researchers sometimes find traces of earlier urban activity. These early phases may include foundations, hearths, and signs of communal labour. Yet the details of these early cities remain elusive because later construction destroyed much of the earlier material. Even so, the presence of earlier layers suggests that urban development occurred in steps rather than sudden leaps. Another interesting aspect involves cities that grew in regions prone to environmental instability. Floods, droughts, or soil exhaustion could force populations to relocate. In such cases, the abandoned city might not decay slowly, but instead be overtaken by natural processes almost immediately. Plants would grow through walls, animals would burrow into structures, soil would accumulate. Within a few hundred years, the outlines would blur. After 1,000 or more, only careful excavation could reveal the former presence of a city. These locations are often difficult to study because repeated environmental changes distort the original layout. Urban centres built in forested regions face similar challenges. Dense vegetation grows quickly, covering structures and pushing apart foundations. Roots can break apart walls, while fallen leaves accumulate into layers that hide the underlying forms. When these forests are cleared, faint outlines may appear. Straight lines or unnatural depressions may emerge, but the full structure is often difficult to reconstruct. These hints suggest the presence of cities that once existed, but now lie beneath layers of organic material. Some of the most compelling suspected cities are those that appear in unexpected locations. When researchers find evidence of large-scale human activity in areas thought to be unsuitable for permanent settlements, it challenges assumptions about how ancient societies adapted to their environments. For example, terraces found high in mountainous regions suggest stable agricultural communities that cultivated steep landscapes. The absence of visible buildings does not diminish the effort required to build and maintain such terraces. In many cases, terraces remain long after the buildings associated with them disappear. Understanding suspected cities requires acknowledging how much evidence can disappear over time. Even in ideal preservation conditions, fragile materials rarely survive. Wood decays, textiles disintegrate, leather, bone, and plant fibers break down. If a culture used these materials extensively, then even the largest cities could leave little behind. The archaeology of absence becomes essential in these cases, combining environmental studies, soil science, and subtle spatial patterns to identify what once stood in those regions. As researchers continue to develop new technologies, some of the cities we only suspect today may become part of the cities we know. Deeper ground penetrating radar, improved underwater mapping, and more refined chemical analysis of sediments will likely reveal more about these hidden urban worlds. Each discovery adds another layer to the understanding of human history, reminding us that many societies existed in forms that have not yet been fully recognized. And as these discoveries accumulate, our picture of the ancient world becomes more detailed, more varied, and more reflective of the diverse ways people have lived on this planet. Tracing the disappearance of ancient societies becomes more revealing when we stop treating vanishing as an unusual event, and instead recognize it as something that has happened countless times throughout human history. Cities dissolve into the landscapes around them. Traditions shift until they no longer resemble earlier forms. Communities relocate gradually enough that the movement leaves little behind. When these transitions unfold slowly, the details that would normally anchor a culture in the archaeological record do not survive long enough to be pieced together. As a result, entire worlds pass from recognizable patterns into quiet obscurity, not through dramatic collapse but through ordinary change. Understanding these disappearances begins with recognizing how fragile human presence can be across long spans of time. Even in regions where people lived for many centuries, evidence of their activities might not remain visible today. Materials decay. Structures fail without maintenance. Tools break down into fragments too small to identify. If a community relied mostly on items made from organic materials, those items may vanish within a few decades. When enough time passes, even the traces that do remain can blend with natural processes until the distinction between cultural and geological signals becomes difficult to identify. Some societies disappear because the environments they depended on change faster than they could adapt. River systems shift in ways that remove access to fresh water or fertile soil. Rainfall patterns adjust gradually enough that people move away rather than endure scarcity. These movements don't leave behind dramatic layers of evidence. Instead, they leave behind absences. A region that once supported a thriving population might become empty of artifacts, not because people failed to reach a certain level of complexity, but because their relocation erased the material signs of their presence. Other disappearances stem from choices made within the societies themselves. A community might change its layout, abandon certain practices, or shift economic strategies. Over time, these adjustments can erase earlier cultural signatures. For example, if a group stops building large communal structures and instead adopts more flexible forms of organisation, the earlier structures may degrade until only faint markings remain. Without careful study, later researchers may not realise that two distinct cultural phases existed in the same region. One of the clearest examples of how easy it is for humanity to vanish from the material record appears in regions where construction relied heavily on perishable resources. Dwellings made from thatch, woven fibres, wood, or local vegetation rarely survive long after abandonment. Even if thousands of people lived in such structures, the archaeological footprint would be minimal. A few post holes, compacted soil, or scattered hearths might remain, but without durable artifacts, identifying the site as a large settlement becomes difficult. Entire communities may have flourished in such regions, leaving behind almost nothing we can detect easily. There are cases where societies appear abruptly in the archaeological record because they switch to more durable materials, even though they existed long before that point. Once they adopted stone, ceramics, or metal, the material traces of their activities increase sharply, giving the impression of a sudden rise in complexity. Yet this impression may be misleading. These societies could have been stable and well organised long before their durable goods appeared. Their earlier phases simply left behind fewer traces. The apparent emergence is less a reflection of their development and more a reflection of what survived. Some vanishing acts involve environmental forces that erase evidence more quickly than archaeologists can retrieve it. Floodplains can wipe away entire layers of habitation. Mud flows bury settlements under meters of sediment. Tropical climates break down everything not made of stone. Over long enough periods, these forces can remove almost all traces of earlier societies. What remains might be limited to scattered artifacts or slight changes in soil chemistry. Without extensive excavation or advanced detection tools, these patterns can go unnoticed. Human movement complicates this picture even further. Many ancient groups moved seasonally or relocated when resources shifted. These movements often left behind small clusters of artifacts, rather than permanent settlements. Over time, such traces disperse or get buried, making it difficult to reconstruct the full extent of the population. Yet these people had traditions, knowledge systems, and social structures. They taught skills across generations, developed technologies suited to their surroundings, and influenced neighbouring communities. Their disappearance from the material record does not reflect a lack of cultural depth, but rather the way their lifestyle shaped the kinds of traces they left behind. There are examples in many parts of the world where landscapes hold signs of long-term human activity without showing any recognisable settlement pattern. In some regions, controlled burning shaped vegetation for centuries, but the people who carried out these practices left behind little else. In others, deep layers of soil reveal repeated cycles of farming, even though no tools or structures survive. These patterns show that communities thrived in these areas, yet the details of their lives remain largely unknown. Their disappearance is not a sudden event, but a gradual fading, as their material contributions merged with the landscape. Disappearance can also result from cultural transformation. A group may shift its identity so thoroughly that modern researchers have difficulty connecting earlier phases of the same society. Changing languages, artistic styles, trade routes, or burial practices can create the impression of a new culture appearing suddenly. In reality, these transitions happen gradually. The older identity fades until only small traces link it to its successors. Without continuous written records or durable symbols, these connections are easy to lose. There are regions where the archaeological record shows intermittent occupation, with long gaps between periods of clear activity. These gaps can result from climate changes or population movements, but they also reflect the limitations of preservation. A society might have lived in the area during the gap but left behind little that survived. Later populations may have disrupted or scattered earlier evidence. The remaining traces often look sparse compared to the societies that use more durable materials, creating the appearance of absence where life once flourished. Some societies disappear because they integrate into larger cultural networks. When two groups merge, the smaller one may lose its distinct material culture. Their traditions may continue within the larger group, but their independent identity fades from the record. Over time, the unique markers of the smaller society vanish, leaving behind only the generalized signature of the dominant culture. This kind of disappearance is subtle, occurring not through collapse but through integration and assimilation. Another form of vanishing occurs when societies abandon monumental construction. Without continuous maintenance, large structures deteriorate quickly. Stone erodes, earthworks collapse, timber decays. If a community shifts its focus away from large constructions and towards smaller, more flexible architectural forms, the earlier monumental phase may disappear almost entirely. Researchers might interpret the region as having limited complexity, until deeper investigations reveal traces of the earlier structures. Certain societies vanish from the record because their materials were repurposed by later populations. When new groups occupy an old site, they often dismantle earlier structures to reuse the materials. Stones from an earlier building become part of a new one. Wood gets burned or reworked. Clay is reshaped into new vessels. After several cycles of reuse, the original structures become nearly impossible to identify. The earlier society appears to have vanished, even though its materials live on in altered forms. Some disappearances reflect the impact of conflict, though the evidence for conflict does not always survive clearly. Fires can destroy wooden settlements entirely. Battles leave behind artifacts that decay quickly or scatter. If a community relocates because of conflict, it may leave behind little more than abandoned foundations. Over time, erosion removes even those. Later populations may avoid the area, preventing new construction that might otherwise preserve older layers. Eventually, the site becomes indistinguishable from surrounding land. Natural disasters also explain many vanished societies. A single volcanic eruption can bury an entire region. Over thousands of years, erosion can wear away the ash layers until the underlying structures remain hidden or damaged. Earthquakes can topple buildings, making them structurally unrecognizable. Rising seas can submerge entire coastlines. These events shape the archaeological record significantly. Some societies experienced such events and left behind clear evidence, while others disappeared so thoroughly that their existence is only suspected. Another factor in the disappearance of ancient societies lies in the uneven distribution of archaeological research. Some regions have been studied extensively, while others remain barely examined. Political conditions, accessibility, funding, and local priorities influence where research occurs. In areas with limited archaeological activity, entire cultures may remain unidentified simply because no one has yet looked closely enough. Even when researchers know that people once lived in a region, the details of their societies remain hidden until systematic surveys or excavations are conducted. Some of the most elusive vanished societies are those that lived along ancient trade routes. Their identity may appear in the artifacts they produced or exchanged, but their settlements remain unidentified. The mobility inherent in trade means their communities might have been temporary or distributed across wide areas. Their cultural identity becomes visible mainly through the movement of goods, not through architecture. Once those trade routes decline, the societies themselves can disappear from the record quickly. There are also vanished societies whose existence is suggested not by artifacts, but by gaps in surrounding cultures. For example, when two neighbouring societies show signs of influence that neither developed independently, it implies the presence of an intermediary group. That intermediary society may have served as a cultural bridge, yet left behind so few traces that it cannot be identified directly. Researchers infer its existence from what should be there rather than what is there. When such a society disappears, the absence becomes a clue in itself. Understanding these vanishing acts requires a shift in perspective. Rather than assuming that societies must leave behind clear, durable evidence, it becomes necessary to accept that many lived in ways that naturally produced limited archaeological signatures. Their disappearance is not unusual. It is the expected outcome across thousands of years unless specific preservation conditions are met. The rare societies that remain visible today are exceptions, preserved by fortunate circumstances. These patterns suggest that Earth likely hosted far more cultural diversity and social complexity than the surviving record reflects. Many societies thrived long enough to influence their regions, but not long enough or durably enough to leave behind clear traces. Others endured for centuries before environmental change, migration, or cultural transformation made their material legacy fade. Their disappearance leaves behind a patchwork of clues rather than complete pictures. Each layer of understanding reinforces the idea that human history extends far beyond what is currently documented. The vanishing acts of ancient societies are not mysterious events. They are natural outcomes of time, climate, material choices, and the constant movement of people adapting to their world. These disappearances remind us that the story of humanity includes numerous threads that have not yet been uncovered fully, and many more that may never be known in complete detail. Shifts in climate have altered human history so many times that it becomes difficult to separate the evolution of societies from the environments that shaped them. Instead of seeing climate events as isolated disruptions, it's more accurate to view them as forces that periodically reorganized how people lived, where they settled, and which traditions they carried forward. These disruptions didn't act like sudden catastrophes most of the time. Many unfolded gradually, nudging communities toward new choices until entire ways of life changed, often without leaving behind clear evidence of how those transitions happened. When climate conditions moved in new directions, they effectively reset the rhythm of human development, marking fresh beginnings that often erased earlier cultural footprints. Tracing these patterns starts with acknowledging how dependent early societies were on stable environmental conditions. Even minor changes in rainfall, temperature, or seasonal cycles could shift the balance between prosperity and scarcity. A region that once supported agriculture might become unreliable for crops. A valley that once provided enough water for large populations might begin to dry. Each adjustment forced people to reconsider their locations, their farming patterns, their hunting strategies, or their social organization. Over time, these decisions accumulated until the cultural landscape looked nothing like it had in earlier centuries. Climate shifts rarely create uniform effects across a region. One area might become more fertile while another nearby becomes less viable. These uneven changes influence migration patterns. People gravitate toward favourable conditions, forming new communities or merging with existing ones. The places they leave behind gradually lose their visible cultural signatures. Buildings collapse, farmlands revert to natural vegetation, and tools deteriorate. After enough generations pass, the earlier phases of habitation may become nearly impossible to detect. Climate-driven relocation doesn't just move people, it also controls which parts of their history remain visible. In some regions, the disappearance of societies aligns closely with known climate events. Drought cycles in ancient Africa show how quickly stable communities can shift when water becomes scarce. Archaeological surveys reveal that settlements shrink or disperse as rainfall decreases. But while such events explain why people moved, they do not preserve the details of the lives that changed during those periods. The transitions appear as gaps in the record rather than detailed stories. Climate becomes the silent force shaping which histories survive and which dissolve into the background. Coastal societies demonstrate this pattern clearly. Rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age submerged vast areas where people once lived, worked, and formed the foundations of their cultures. These coastlines were ideal environments, offering abundant food resources and easy travel. When the water rose, entire communities moved inland, taking their knowledge with them. The built environments they left behind disappeared beneath the waves. Even if those societies were complex, the physical evidence of their cities and structures became difficult to reach. Today, underwater exploration reveals only small portions of what might have existed. The climate reset those worlds by physically removing them, erasing the surface traces that could have connected them to later societies. There are patterns in Europe and Asia where colder periods forced populations to reorganize. When temperatures dropped during certain phases of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, people adapted by changing their tools, altering their diets, or relocating to more sheltered areas. These adaptations show up in archaeological layers, but the earlier sites often lack the continuity needed to track the full story. Climate-driven challenges compressed populations into smaller, more manageable zones, leaving their previous settlements to degrade over time. The visible evidence of earlier lifestyles became faint enough that it's easy to overlook how long those societies had existed before climate pressure forced them to move. In some areas, climate change brought benefits rather than hardships, creating opportunities for rapid cultural development. Warmer periods opened new migration routes, expanded fertile regions, and allowed populations to grow. These expansions left behind clearer material traces, making those societies easier to study. Yet their predecessors, who lived in harsher conditions, often left fewer durable artifacts. Their stories sit lower in the soil with less visibility, overshadowed by the layers built during more favourable times. Climate shifts didn't just change the way people lived, they influenced how well their histories would survive. One of the most striking examples of climate resetting human development involves the large-scale floods that occurred after glacial meltwater surged through major river systems. These floods could change entire landscapes within a single generation. Fertile valleys might transform into wetlands. Stable ground might become unstable. People relocated quickly to avoid the changing conditions. Because such rapid changes forced sudden movement, the settlements abandoned during those events often contain fewer items left behind in clear patterns. Without those patterns, researchers have a harder time reconstructing what those societies looked like before their relocation. Another climate-driven shift involves the gradual spread of deserts. Regions that were once grassy and productive slowly became arid. As the Sahara expanded north and south over thousands of years, communities that lived near rivers and lakes eventually left those areas. The structures built during wetter periods deteriorated quickly once vegetation disappeared and wind erosion increased. The climate did not simply force people to move, it removed the environmental conditions necessary to preserve evidence of their earlier settlements. As a result, entire cultural phases vanish from easy detection. Climate also affects what kinds of artifacts survive. In colder environments, organic materials can remain preserved for thousands of years, offering detailed insights into how people lived. But in warm, humid environments, those same materials disappear quickly. A society that depended heavily on wood, woven fibre, or animal products would leave almost nothing behind in a tropical climate. When temperature and humidity levels shift in these regions, preservation conditions change as well. The slightest changes can erase vast amounts of evidence. Climate resets the archaeological clock by controlling what survives long enough to be studied. In addition to material decay, climate influences soil chemistry, which in turn affects how well items fossilize. In some regions, shifting precipitation or wind patterns reshape the soil so frequently that artifacts become scattered. Over centuries, once dense settlement areas may appear thinly populated simply because the soil processes removed or dispersed items. When these patterns take hold, the story of those societies becomes harder to reconstruct. Climate reduces the clarity of the archaeological record not because the societies lacked complexity, but because the conditions necessary for preservation were unstable. Another climate-related factor that shapes the visibility of past societies involves natural vegetation cycles. When a region becomes wetter or warmer, forests expand into areas previously used for farming or building. These forests conceal ground features and disrupt the soil. Roots break apart structures. Leaf layers fill depressions that once marked dwellings or communal areas. Over time, the cultural signatures become buried beneath natural growth. Climate drives the expansion of vegetation, and that expansion reshapes the landscape to the point where ancient settlement patterns fade from view. On the other hand, when climate conditions shift toward dryness or colder temperatures, vegetation may retreat. This can expose some archaeological features that were previously hidden. Yet exposure also invites rapid erosion, which removes the upper layers that might have preserved earlier phases of human activity. Even as climate reveals some traces, it can destroy others. The balance between exposure and preservation is delicate. Climate resets the archaeological surface continuously, promoting visibility in some areas while erasing evidence elsewhere. One of the most challenging aspects of tracking vanished societies involves periods when climate forced culturally significant transitions. These transitions often appear abrupt in the archaeological record because they reflect rapid changes in how people lived. For example, when rainfall became more irregular, some groups switched from farming to herding. Herding societies leave fewer permanent traces because their lifestyle involves mobility. This change makes it harder for researchers to link earlier farming phases with later herding phases. The climate may not have destroyed evidence, but it changed the way societies created evidence. What remains can look like a discontinuity, even when cultural continuity persisted in other forms. When glacial periods ended, migrations into newly accessible lands reshaped human distribution across continents. These migrations often involved small groups exploring unfamiliar regions with limited resources. They built temporary shelters, used local materials, and created toolkits suited to mobility. Such societies left behind few durable structures, but their presence influenced the genetic, linguistic, and cultural landscapes that followed. Climate created opportunities for expansion, but such expansions left minimal markers. Today, the archaeological traces often appear as isolated artifacts or dispersions that are difficult to connect into a coherent narrative. Another factor involves bodies of water created or lost during climate shifts. Lakes may form or dry up depending on rainfall and temperature patterns. When lakes shrink, the surrounding communities may move closer to new water sources. The earlier settlements are left behind as shorelines change. Without continued use, the structures decay. Later, sediment or vegetation fills in the spaces. Conversely, when lakes expand during wet periods, settlements near the old shoreline may be submerged. The new underwater conditions prevent researchers from accessing those areas easily. Climate shapes where water lies, and water shapes where people live. These interactions determine which parts of history remain within reach. In many regions, climate shifts led to periods of fragmentation. Larger populations broke into smaller groups as resources changed. Each smaller group carried portions of their earlier cultural identity. Over time, these fragments evolved separately, creating diverse traditions. When researchers examine these regions today, the earlier unity is difficult to detect. The climate-driven dispersal erased the recognizable coherence that might have defined them as a single cultural entity. The vanished unity lies not in a lost city or missing artifact, but in the absence of direct links among dispersed groups. There are also scenarios where climate encouraged technological innovation. When temperatures changed or resources declined, societies adapted by altering their tools, housing structures, or food strategies. These innovations appear clearly in the archaeological record, yet the transitional phases leading to them often remain unclear. The climate reset the developmental timeline by creating new conditions that required different solutions. What came before may not have survived long enough to show how those innovations emerged. Researchers see the results, but not the full pathway leading to them. Sometimes climate resets create the illusion of new cultural arrivals. When a region undergoes significant environmental change, earlier settlements might disappear entirely, leaving behind a century or more of little to no evidence. Later, when conditions stabilize again, new settlements appear. To archaeologists, this can look like a sudden appearance of a new culture, but in reality, the earlier culture may have relocated, adapted, or survived in different places. The climate erased the continuity, creating a gap where human activity continued elsewhere but left no durable record. Pastoral societies offer another example of climate reshaping human distribution. When grasslands expanded due to changing temperatures, herders moved through regions previously unsuitable for grazing. Their mobility leaves behind fewer permanent markers. Even though these societies could be highly organized, their material record is thin. Over time, climate-driven expansions and contractions of grazing land produce alternating periods of visibility and invisibility in the archaeological record. The societies themselves didn't disappear. Their traces simply became harder to capture due to the lifestyle choices climate encouraged. The variability of climate also affects long-term preservation indirectly by influencing animal behavior. Burrowing animals disturb settlement layers. Grazing animals remove vegetation that protects archaeological remains. As ecosystems shift, the animals adapt, and their activities shape the preservation landscape. This complicates the picture of human history. Evidence may be removed, scattered, or reburied. Climate, through ecological impacts, alters the visibility of societies in unexpected ways. Each climate-driven change reinforces the idea that the archaeological record reflects not only what people did, but also the conditions under which their actions were preserved. Climate resets the human clock by changing the contexts in which societies form, thrive, move, and disappear. These resets shape the fragments that survive and influence how much of earlier worlds we can still see. Many of the most interesting societies in human history were not hidden by distant secrecy or dramatic collapse, but by the simple fact that their way of living blended so closely with their surroundings that later generations often overlooked them. These were communities that shaped landscapes without leaving dramatic ruins, developed knowledge systems without producing written archives, and organized themselves in ways that do not match the conventional image of ancient civilization. Their presence persisted for centuries, yet the traces they left behind blended into the environment so easily that they were not recognized as cultural legacies until researchers studied the ground more closely. What makes these societies noteworthy is not that they disappeared or remained small. Many were large, stable, and highly influential within their regions. Their influence spread through patterns of land use, resource management, and controlled seasonal activities. Yet because they relied on materials that do not last, or because their architecture did not aim for permanence, the evidence of their existence often remained hidden in places that archaeologists walked over many times without realizing what lay just beneath the surface. One example of this type of society appears in regions where people practiced intensive land cultivation without building large permanent structures. These groups managed soil quality, irrigation, and plant diversity with enough skill to support substantial populations. However, the physical signatures of their communities became subtle after the land was abandoned or repopulated. Soil enrichment, altered vegetation patterns, and the distribution of microscopic remains became the only remaining indicators. The population centres that once existed in these landscapes did not leave behind stone walls or monuments, but they shaped their surroundings in lasting ways that only became clear when researchers applied advanced analysis. Another instance involves communities that relied on detailed ecological knowledge to create stability. They maintained controlled burns to shape the growth of forests or grasslands. These fires produced environments that supported agriculture, hunting, or gathering in consistent ways across generations. The people who practiced these methods did not leave behind obvious structures, but they built cultural systems that required cooperation, planning, and shared understanding. The land itself held their signature, though it took modern techniques to reveal how long and how effectively they managed it. Some societies were concealed by the environments they inhabited. Dense forests, wetlands, and areas with rapid vegetation growth make it challenging to detect past human activity. In these regions, structures degrade quickly, organic materials vanish, and soil processes obscure ground features. Even large settlements can disappear in a relatively short span of time when plants reclaim the space. Without mapping technologies that detect subtle changes in elevation or soil density, earlier researchers often assumed such areas held little evidence of complex settlement simply because they could not see it. The Amazon rainforest provides one of the clearest illustrations of this challenge. For centuries, people assumed that large organised groups could not have lived in such a demanding environment. But once aerial surveys and LiDAR mapping revealed geometric earthworks and interconnected road systems, a very different picture emerged. These features suggest that ancient communities constructed planned spaces, coordinated labour, and reorganised landscapes across large distances. Yet traditional archaeological excavation had difficulty locating these patterns because the rainforest concealed them so completely. The societies that created them were not small or disorganised. They simply built in ways that nature could reclaim swiftly. There are also societies that blended into the archaeological record because they were integrated into broader cultural networks. These groups may have contributed innovations, agricultural practices, or trade routes that influenced surrounding populations. However, their own settlements left minimal remains. Their influence manifests indirectly through shifts in artifacts, food systems, or settlement distributions rather than through identifiable cities or monuments. In some cases, researchers recognize the impact of such a society long before they find direct evidence of its settlements. The people themselves can remain hidden in plain sight because the traces they left do not conform to standard expectations. Another type of hidden society involves groups that constructed temporary or seasonally reused structures. These communities might return to the same areas year after year, but build dwellings that they dismantled or abandoned each season. Such patterns leave behind minimal artifacts, often scattered or buried under later activity. The ephemeral nature of their architecture makes it difficult to determine how large or organised the community actually was. Yet studies of plant remains, hunting patterns, and soil disturbance show that many such groups maintained consistent traditions over centuries, shaping the land in subtle but meaningful ways. There are also societies whose visibility was masked by later development. When new populations built over older settlements, they sometimes reused materials, restructured the ground, or removed earlier features. Over time, the distinctive elements of the earlier society were overwritten. Even when archaeologists uncover deeper layers, the earlier presence may appear as isolated remains rather than a coherent settlement. Without continuous occupation or durable structures, the earlier society becomes difficult to identify. It remains hidden until researchers conduct detailed stratigraphic analysis. In many cases, the reason these societies remain concealed is simply that they did not use long-lasting materials. The absence of stone structures or fired ceramics can make a settlement nearly invisible archaeologically. People who built with earth, wood, animal hides, or plant material left traces that deteriorate quickly. The cultural significance of these groups does not diminish because their materials failed to endure. Their influence can still be detected in patterns of burned areas, soil nutrients, or pollen remains. But the lack of recognisable artefacts means they often remain unacknowledged until researchers look for evidence beyond traditional indicators. Societies can also hide in plain sight through the reuse of land. When an area is occupied repeatedly over thousands of years, earlier layers may be disturbed. People building new structures may flatten earlier mounds, fill in depressions, or rearrange the land. These actions make it difficult to detect earlier settlement phases. Even when excavations reveal fragments from earlier periods, they may appear too scattered to suggest organised communities. The earlier societies become part of the foundational layers of the landscape, present but obscured by later development. There are instances where geography conceals societies effectively. Communities living on floodplains, deltas, or shifting coastlines face constant environmental changes. Floods deposit new layers of sediment that bury structures and artifacts. When floodwaters return repeatedly, they can create thick accumulations that make earlier settlements difficult to access. Researchers sometimes discover these societies only when construction projects or deep geological cores reveal unexpected layers. Until then, the communities remain invisible because the land itself hides them. Certain mountainous regions also hold societies that remained unseen for long periods. People who settled in terraces or narrow valleys may have constructed homes that blended seamlessly into the rock or earth. Over time, erosion, vegetation, and landslides can obscure these structures completely. Their settlements may be detectable only through unusual rock arrangements or faint soil differences. Such groups could sustain long-term populations, yet modern observers would never realise their presence without specialised investigation. Some societies remain hidden because their traditions produced few material remains. Practices related to food, ceremony, or community life may have relied on biodegradable items. Even burial practices vary widely across cultures. Societies that place their dead in locations or structures prone to erosion leave behind fewer indicators of their presence. Without durable rituals or burial markers, these groups disappear quickly from the archaeological record, even if they were influential in their broader region. Another type of hidden society involves extensive trade networks. These groups may not have built large settlements, but their impact is recorded through the distribution of goods across wide areas. Their settlements themselves may remain elusive because they were built with perishable materials or located in regions where preservation is poor. Yet the goods they traded, stones, shells, minerals, or crafted items, travelled far beyond their homeland. Their existence is confirmed not by their remains, but by the presence of their items in distant sites. They remain culturally important but archaeologically understated. Urban societies can also hide beneath modern cities. Many ancient settlements lie under layers of contemporary construction. Streets, buildings, and infrastructure prevent excavation in these areas. Even when archaeological investigations occur during development, the results are often limited to small samples. If the earlier society did not build in stone or produce numerous artifacts, its presence can remain unrecognised. The modern city effectively conceals the ancient one, making it difficult to reconstruct the earlier cultural landscape. There are regions where societies remain hidden because researchers did not previously expect complex settlements to exist there. Assumptions about environmental limits, cultural trajectories, or resource availability influenced how archaeologists approach certain landscapes. When new evidence emerges in such places, it challenges long-standing expectations. The societies that lived there were always present, but the frameworks used to interpret the archaeological record did not accommodate their existence. Adjusting those frameworks reveals patterns that were previously overlooked. Not all hidden societies were small or diffuse. Some were capable of large-scale construction using materials that later vanished. Their earthworks, canals, or road systems may appear faintly today, detectable only through technologies that identify ground variations. These features indicate organised labour, planning, and population density, yet the absence of durable architecture keeps them out of conventional narratives. The societies behind these constructions may have been as complex as better-known civilizations, but simply built in ways that were more easily reclaimed by the environment. Some societies hide because they developed cultural practices that minimized material accumulation. Their values, beliefs, or social structures encourage limited physical imprint. They may have focused on practices that emphasize mobility, sustainability, or balanced use of resources. Such approaches leave behind fewer artifacts and structures. The cultural richness remains, but the archaeological signature becomes minimal. Without written records, these societies become difficult to document in detail, despite their long-term presence. As research techniques advance, more of these hidden worlds become visible. LIDAR surveys reveal landscapes filled with subtle human modifications. Soil chemistry identifies cultivation where none was previously suspected. Micro-artifact analysis exposes patterns that indicate sustained human occupation. Each of these discoveries highlights the many ways societies can exist without leaving the kinds of evidence that survive easily. These hidden societies expand the understanding of how varied human life has been across time. They demonstrate that civilization does not require stone temples or monumental architecture. It can emerge through land management, trade, mobility, or cultural cohesion. The absence of dramatic ruins does not mean the absence of societal complexity. It only means the complexity took forms that blended more seamlessly with the natural world. Ideas that once shaped entire communities can disappear so thoroughly that only scattered hints remain, leaving researchers to reconstruct achievements that were once common knowledge for the people who developed them. This loss does not mean those communities lacked insight or innovation. Rather, it reflects how easily knowledge can fade when circumstances change. Skills tied to particular environments, methods that depended on specific materials, and systems of understanding grounded in oral traditions can vanish quickly when populations relocate, reorganize, or face environmental pressures. What might have been ordinary understanding for one generation becomes an unsolved question for another many centuries later. Reconstructing what vanished knowledge looked like requires paying attention to patterns in the material record that don't align with the simplest explanations. When tools appear more advanced than their surrounding context suggests, or when agricultural systems demonstrate organization beyond what remains of settlement structures, it indicates that the people who created them understood far more than what the surviving evidence reveals. Their ingenuity becomes visible not through grand monuments or written texts, but through the sophistication embedded in everyday objects and landscape modifications. These traces hint at minds that solved practical problems efficiently, even if the full system behind those solutions no longer survives. There are many instances where knowledge appears to have been widespread, yet left no detailed record of how it was taught or transmitted. Agricultural practices offer one example. In several ancient regions, farmers developed methods to maintain soil fertility across long periods without exhausting the land. These methods relied on rotations, controlled burning, or careful selection of crop varieties. While the tools associated with this work degrade quickly, the long-term effects on the soil remain detectable. Those patterns show that the people who lived there understood ecological balances that are only now being relearned through scientific investigation. Their knowledge fit the rhythms of their environment so well that it persisted for centuries before vanishing during later disruptions. Another area where knowledge disappeared involves the management of water systems. Early irrigation networks, flood control structures, and channels appear in places where no written guides remain to explain their design. These systems required coordinated labour, planning, and an understanding of hydrology. Yet the communities who built them often left a little beyond the altered ground itself. Once abandoned, the systems fell apart slowly. Channels filled with sediment, embankments collapsed, water patterns changed. Without clear architectural remains, later observers struggled to identify the intelligence behind the landscape. Only recent studies that map soil moisture or underground features reveal how carefully these systems were arranged. Knowledge tied to navigation and long-distance movement also demonstrates how easily expertise can disappear. In regions where people relied on seasonal migrations or trade routes, they developed a deep understanding of terrain, weather patterns, and natural markers. These skills allowed them to travel across vast distances with consistency. When those routes shifted or populations dispersed, the knowledge sometimes faded within a few generations. Modern researchers may find physical traces of movement, such as tool fragments or food remains distributed along predictable paths, yet the methods people used to navigate those routes remain unclear. Their genius was embedded in memory, not monuments, and memory is one of the most fragile containers the past relies on. Technology based on organic materials represents another category of lost knowledge. Items made from wood, fibre, bone, resin, or hides degrade too quickly to survive long periods unless preserved under rare conditions. Tools crafted from these materials may have been sophisticated, lightweight, and efficient, but because they do not fossilize well, their full forms are rarely known. In places where people used organic tools extensively, the archaeological record can appear misleadingly simple. The absence of durable artifacts suggests limited innovation, even when the opposite was likely true. Reconstructing such technologies requires careful comparison of wear patterns on surviving tools or analysis of soil residues that hint at what materials were once present. The languages spoken by ancient societies also carried knowledge now lost. Without written forms, linguistic traditions rely entirely on oral transmission. Stories, instructions, and shared understandings can last many generations, but they must be repeated consistently to survive. When a community experiences environmental disruption, migration, or cultural merging, the languages involved may change rapidly. Elements of earlier knowledge can be absorbed into new forms or forgotten entirely. The disappearance of a language represents more than the loss of vocabulary. It marks the fading of a worldview shaped by unique environmental experiences, technological practices, and social structures. Even if physical remnants survive, the interpretive framework that made sense of them may disappear. In some cases, the material record shows evidence of complex craftsmanship, requiring specialized skills, yet the training systems that supported such craftsmanship left no trace. Stone tool making offers one example. Certain styles demonstrate remarkable precision, consistent shapes, and efficient materials used. To produce these tools, individuals needed training from experienced makers, but no instructional text existed. Skills passed from person to person through practice. When communities changed or split, those traditions could fade quickly if not preserved. The tools remain, but the full range of knowledge behind them vanishes. Large stone constructions also demonstrate missing knowledge in subtle ways. While many surviving structures appear stable or symmetrical, the techniques used to transport, shape, and place the stones might not be fully understood. Even when researchers identify quarries, they sometimes lack evidence of the exact tools and methods used to move the stone. The absence does not imply mystery in a sensational sense. It simply shows how many details of practical engineering become hidden when the day-to-day methods are not recorded. The knowledge that supported such projects could be widespread among the workers, yet disappear entirely once the community no longer built similar structures. A similar phenomenon appears in metallurgy. Some ancient communities developed methods for producing metal objects with consistent quality, controlled hardness, and distinct alloy compositions. They achieved this without leaving behind written descriptions of their processes. Over time, as population shifted or external influences changed material preferences, those metallurgical traditions stopped being used. The knowledge disappeared even though the objects remained. Researchers can analyze the composition of artifacts, but the specific steps involved, the chosen temperatures, the sequence of mixing, the shaping methods, often remain uncertain. Another domain where knowledge was lost involves medicinal practices. Many societies developed detailed understandings of plants, minerals, and healing methods tailored to local conditions. The expertise spanned generations and required observations that took centuries to refine. When the environment changed or populations relocated, the plants involved might not exist in the new region. Without the original context, the knowledge lost its foundation. The physical remains of medicinal practices rarely survive, making it difficult for researchers to identify what treatments were used or how they were applied. Even if plant residues remain, interpreting them without the corresponding cultural knowledge becomes challenging. Some knowledge systems disappeared because they relied on large community participation. Ceremonial practices, seasonal activities, and coordinated agricultural cycles required shared understanding among many people. When communities fragmented or merged with others, these coordinated practices often dissolved. Without the collective structure, the knowledge embedded in those traditions gradually faded. Archaeologists might find evidence of ritual objects, modified landscapes, or patterned deposits, but the underlying logic of those practices remains elusive. The cultural significance becomes difficult to reconstruct without living memory. In certain regions, lost knowledge becomes evident through the efficiency of abandoned structures. Terraced hillsides, irrigation canals, or storage pits show careful planning, but the methods used to maintain these features or the rules governing their use may have disappeared entirely. The structures survive in altered form, but the knowledge required to operate them effectively no longer exists. Later populations might even misinterpret their original purpose. The genius behind the design becomes misplaced not because the artifacts disappeared, but because the interpretative framework no longer matches the surviving evidence. Another example involves early astronomy. Many societies tracked seasonal changes through careful observations of the sky. They constructed alignments, calibrated timekeeping methods, and monitored celestial events with consistency. The tools they used for this work might not survive beyond simple markers or stone placements. Without clear written explanations, researchers must interpret the surviving alignments based on patterns alone. The knowledge that guided the creation of these structures remains partially visible, but incomplete. The full system, the vocabulary, the teaching methods, the specific observations, disappeared, even though the physical markers persisted. There are also instances where knowledge was intentionally kept within small groups. Specialized roles within a society, such as metal workers, navigators, or ritual leaders, often guarded their techniques closely. When these groups diminished due to population loss, cultural change, or relocation, the specialized knowledge they held could vanish in a single generation. The broader society may have relied on their skills without understanding their technical details. Once those experts were gone, the community lost access to abilities it once depended upon. Archaeology cannot easily recover knowledge that was never widely shared. Another reason knowledge disappears involves changes in resource availability. When certain materials become scarce, due to climate shift or environmental pressures, people stop using techniques that depend on them. Over time, even the memory of how to use those materials fades. For example, if a society traditionally built with a certain type of wood that no longer grows in the region, the building techniques tied to that wood may vanish. The same applies to dyes, minerals, or specific crops. The loss of a single resource can lead to the loss of entire branches of knowledge. Trade disruptions can produce similar effects. When long-distance exchange networks collapse due to migration, conflict, or climate change, communities may lose access to essential materials or tools. The knowledge associated with those items becomes obsolete. Later generations may find artifacts from these periods and struggle to understand how they were used or produced. The disappearance of trade networks creates knowledge gaps that archaeology can only partially fill. Some societies lost knowledge because they reorganized themselves in response to new priorities. When economic or social structures shift, older techniques may no longer be necessary. Over time, people focus on new methods that better fit their circumstances. The earlier systems fade quietly. For example, A community that transitions from agriculture to herding may abandon farming methods that had once been central. Archaeological evidence might show the tools and fields used earlier, but not the full process that sustained them. This shift in lifestyle creates a knowledge gap that researchers must navigate. Knowledge can also disappear through cultural replacement. When groups merge, the dominant culture often imposes its practices. The knowledge systems of the smaller group may survive for a while, but eventually fade. Without written records, their traditions might vanish completely. Even if physical traces remain, the context needed to interpret them may be lost. Researchers may find artifacts without understanding the knowledge that shaped their use. In many cases, the most significant vanished knowledge involves systems of meaning rather than technical skills. Art, ritual, social hierarchy, and belief structures often leave behind symbolic objects or modified landscapes. Yet without the stories that explain those objects, the full significance remains hidden. Archaeologists can identify patterns, but they cannot always reconstruct the cultural meaning. The genius behind these systems is misplaced because the interpretive link broke at some point in the distant past. As tools, methods, and technologies improve, researchers uncover more evidence of ancient ingenuity that was previously overlooked. Microanalysis reveals residues that hint at processes once unknown. Satellite imaging shows structures hidden beneath vegetation. Soil studies expose patterns of land use that indicate significant planning. Each advancement brings new clarity to the question of how ancient societies understood their world. Yet the fuller picture remains elusive because so much knowledge depended on context that no longer exists. These gaps do not imply that ancient people lacked complexity. They reveal how much of human intelligence is embedded in specific conditions and how easily those conditions can shift. Knowledge tied to a particular environment, resource, or social structure becomes vulnerable when any of those foundations change. Over thousands of years, countless insights, skills, and discoveries have been lost simply because they were not preserved in durable forms. The history of humanity becomes easier to understand when we acknowledge that remembering has always taken more effort than forgetting. Every society depends on shared memory to hold its identity together, yet even the strongest traditions can fade once the conditions that support them begin to shift. Memory is not something that remains fixed across long stretches of time. It requires repetition, stable communities, and consistent environments to survive. When any of these elements weaken, knowledge and stories begin to drift. The past becomes harder to reconstruct, not because people intended to erase it, but because memory is among the most fragile tools humans rely on. Looking at the archaeological record, the limits of cultural memory become clear. Many societies existed for centuries before leaving behind a trace that modern researchers can interpret. Their daily lives, beliefs, and achievements were recorded not in permanent forms but in the minds of the people who lived them. Oral traditions kept histories alive as long as communities stayed intact. When populations fragmented or settled in new regions, these narratives often changed or lost context. Over time, the original meaning dissolved and only fragments remained. The process of forgetting rarely followed a dramatic moment. Instead, it occurred gradually as stories shifted, details were shortened, and references became less relevant to changing circumstances. All memory can preserve remarkable amounts of information, yet it requires stability and continuity. When environmental disruptions forced communities to move, the new landscape often reshaped their priorities. Stories tied to earlier places lost their grounding, and younger generations focused on the demands of their new surroundings. What had once been essential knowledge sometimes became irrelevant. Skills related to climate, agriculture, or navigation in a previous region might not apply in a new environment. As those skills faded, the stories that supported them also weakened. The great forgetting did not arise from intentional neglect, but from shifts in survival needs that changed what people chose to hold on to. Written records help preserve memory, but even they are far from reliable across long timelines. Many early writing systems served specific administrative purposes. They recorded trade, taxes, or ritual schedules rather than personal histories or detailed accounts of daily life. When those systems fell out of use, their documents became unreadable unless later societies preserved the knowledge of how to interpret them. Some scripts disappear entirely when their cultural context vanishes. Even when inscriptions survive physically, the meaning behind them can be lost once the language no longer has living speakers. The fragility of writing becomes apparent when researchers discover tablets or carvings, but lack the linguistic knowledge necessary to understand them. What remains becomes a symbol of memory without the memory itself. Memory also disappears through the ordinary passage of time. A story repeated across many generations shifts slightly with each retelling. Details that once mattered can fade if later generations consider them less important. Explanations may shorten, characters may merge, lessons may shift to match new cultural norms. Over centuries, these changes accumulate until the story no longer resembles its original form. If material evidence survives, researchers can compare these stories against the archaeological record. But when no materials remain, the story becomes whatever shape the community has given it across its retellings. The original version becomes unreachable, preserved only as a possibility. Some societies maintained complex systems of memory based on ritual. These systems relied on repetition, symbolic actions, and communal participation. As long as the rituals continued, the knowledge embedded within them persisted. When the structure supporting these rituals weakened, the memory began to unravel. Without regular practice, even rituals that once held central meaning could fade quickly. The objects associated with them might remain, but without the instructions or meanings that guided their use, those objects become puzzles for later researchers. The great forgetting becomes visible not through what is found, but through the uncertainty that surrounds it. Memory can also weaken when societies reorganize or merge. When two cultural groups combine, one set of traditions often becomes dominant. The other may persist for a time, but eventually loses prominence. Over generations, younger members adopt the dominant traditions, allowing the smaller set to fade. The stories, techniques, and beliefs of the absorbed group may become partially preserved within the new culture, but the original distinctions disappear. Archaeological evidence can show that multiple groups once occupied the same region, yet the memory of how they interacted or merged may vanish entirely. This process occurs frequently across human history, and plays a major role in how many forgotten civilizations slipped from collective awareness. Another contributor to forgetting lies within languages themselves. A language holds far more than vocabulary. It shapes how people categorize the world, how they describe their surroundings, and how they remember their past. When a language disappears, entire ways of understanding the world disappear with it. Traditions that depend on specific phrasing, tonal patterns, or linguistic structure cannot be fully translated into new languages. Once communities transition to new linguistic forms, the older framework becomes inaccessible. Researchers may recover fragments through comparison or reconstruction, but the full memory encoded within the language is lost. Migration patterns accelerate this process. When people move into new regions with different resources, they must adjust their techniques, stories, and daily practices. Over generations, earlier knowledge becomes less relevant. For example, societies that once depended on fishing methods tied to a particular coastline might lose that knowledge after moving inland. The stories connected to those practices might persist for a while, but eventually they lose meaning. Without relevance to current life, memory becomes vulnerable. The practical foundation that supported the story disappears, and the story eventually follows. Catastrophic events create sudden gaps in memory as well. Floods, volcanic eruptions, or severe climate shifts can scatter communities abruptly. When these events occur, The people who survive may find themselves separated from those who carried important knowledge. In the aftermath, maintaining cultural continuity becomes challenging. Some traditions survive in altered form, others vanish altogether. The archaeological record sometimes preserves evidence of these disruptions, but rarely captures the full story of how communities reconstructed their lives. The great forgetting emerges in the aftermath, when the stories that once linked people to their history are overshadowed by the need to adapt and rebuild. Technology also influences memory preservation. Societies that adopt new tools may abandon older techniques. Once those earlier technologies fall out of use, the knowledge behind them can disappear quickly. This is especially true for specialized crafts that require years of training. When economic or cultural changes reduce the demand for certain crafts, the training system weakens. Within a few generations, the techniques may vanish. Archaeologists may find the objects produced by those techniques without understanding how they were made. The loss of underlying knowledge makes those artifacts harder to interpret, creating gaps in understanding that reflect the fragile nature of cultural memory. The great forgetting becomes even more apparent when we examine the transition between different settlement types. When societies shift from mobile lifestyles to settled agriculture, or vice versa, their stories and memory systems adapt to match the needs of their environment. Stories that once described seasonal patterns may lose relevance when people no longer move. New stories emerge to describe settled life. The earlier stories may survive in fragments or symbolic form, but their practical meaning fades. Over long periods, those fragments become difficult to interpret without context. Researchers may find traces of symbolic behavior without understanding the original purpose. Some forgetting occurs because societies intentionally reorganize their narratives. Communities sometimes revise their histories to reflect new identities, values, or political structures. When this happens, earlier narratives may be suppressed or reframed. Over time, the older versions disappear as newer generations learn the revised form. Without written records of the earlier narratives, modern researchers cannot access the original stories. The archaeological record may show evidence of earlier practices, but the cultural explanations behind them are lost. Memory also weakens when populations become small enough that knowledge cannot be passed effectively. If a community shrinks due to disease, migration, or resource scarcity, the number of people capable of transmitting specialized knowledge declines. Some skills require a broad base of practitioners to sustain them. When that base erodes, the tradition can collapse. Archaeologists sometimes find evidence of sophisticated technologies that appear to decline rapidly. The disappearance does not mean the society forgot deliberately. It means the conditions that supported the knowledge system changed, and the knowledge could not survive without its social framework. Archaeology can reveal forgotten structures but rarely restores forgotten meaning. Consider symbolic artifacts or ceremonial objects. While their form might survive, the layers of meaning they once held do not. Researchers may infer general interpretations based on comparison with similar objects from other cultures, but these inferences have limits. The original cultural memory, the exact explanations, stories, and beliefs cannot be recovered completely. This gap highlights how dependent memory is on living context. There are also examples where communities actively preserved memory for long periods, yet small disruptions eventually broke the continuity. Oral histories kept by certain groups trace back thousands of years, but when those groups face displacement, assimilation, or population decline, the stories either fragmented or adapted. Even well-preserved traditions change gradually. These changes demonstrate how memory evolves, sometimes in ways that obscure its earliest origins. The great forgetting is not always sudden. It can unfold through subtle adjustments that accumulate across generations. Knowledge loss often becomes clear when researchers encounter sudden jumps in the archaeological record. For example, a society might demonstrate advanced engineering practices at one point and much simpler structures later. This shift suggests that certain skills or knowledge systems weakened or disappeared entirely. The reasons vary. Changes in leadership, shifts in resource availability, or transformations in cultural priorities can all contribute. What remains visible are the artifacts that survived, not the explanations for why certain knowledge disappeared. In several regions, researchers find isolated artifacts that seem more advanced than the surrounding evidence suggests. These items often appear without accompanying structures or technological context. One explanation is that the broader knowledge needed to produce them vanished soon after they were created. Without the supporting framework, such technologies cannot continue. The artifacts remain as isolated reminders of what once existed. The genius behind them becomes misplaced because the cultural memory that anchored it did not survive. Memory can also weaken when societies change their modes of communication. If a group transitions from oral traditions to partial writing systems or vice versa, some information may not transfer effectively. Instructions that depend on tone, rhythm, or gesture might not translate well into written forms. Conversely, written records may contain complexities that become inaccessible once literacy declines. These transitions create selective gaps in memory that affect how later generations interpret their own past. Archaeologists sometimes discover evidence of large-scale events without clear narratives explaining them. Settlement discontinuities, sudden shifts in artifact style, or changes in diet may indicate significant cultural transformations. Yet without records or oral histories, the reasons behind these changes remain uncertain. The Great Forgetting operates in these gaps, showing how much of human history depends on memory systems that cannot endure indefinitely. As research continues, the fragility of memory becomes more apparent. Even societies that produced written documents faced vulnerabilities. Fire, moisture, insects, and conflict can destroy archives quickly. Many ancient texts survived only by chance, often preserved in rare environments where decay slows. The vast majority of written documents from early societies no longer exist. The preserved examples represent a small fraction of what once circulated. Without those missing documents, our understanding remains partial. The Great Forgetting is not a single event but an ongoing process. It reflects the natural limits of human memory, the instability of environments, and the continuous reorganization of societies. As we explore the world's ancient landscapes, we encounter not just artifacts and structures, but the remnants of forgotten knowledge, stories, and identities. These remnants remind us that history is shaped as much by what disappears as by what remains. Stories passed from one generation to another often contain more geography than they appear to at first glance. People have always explained their surroundings through narrative, and in many cases these narratives hold details that point toward earlier landscapes, forgotten settlements, or cultural memories that no longer resemble factual accounts, but still echo traces of real places. When researchers examine myths closely, they sometimes find elements that match physical evidence later uncovered through excavation or environmental study. These connections show how stories can preserve fragments of history long after their original context has faded, turning myths into informal maps that help trace older worlds. Myths persist because they serve practical and emotional functions within societies. They help organize seasons, reinforce group identity, and explain natural events. While their purposes vary, many contain descriptions of land features, resource locations, or significant events that shaped the lives of earlier communities. As these stories evolve, geographical details may become symbolic, but their roots often lie in observations of the environment. When such stories survive across centuries, they can preserve information about landscapes that changed or disappeared entirely. This process makes myths valuable sources for understanding how people once viewed the world around them. One example of myths functioning as geographical memory appears in stories that describe floods, shifting rivers, or disappearing coastlines. While some narratives emphasize supernatural causes, their underlying details sometimes align with known geological events. Communities that lived through major environmental changes often encoded their experiences in story form. Once written records were lost or never created, these stories became the primary method for preserving local history. Later generations repeated them without necessarily understanding that they reflected real events. Modern researchers comparing these stories with geological data sometimes find that both sets of evidence point to the same changes in landscape. Stories tied to mountains, forests, or rivers may also preserve information about earlier settlement patterns. When myths describe journeys, boundaries, or sacred locations, they often reference actual landmarks important to the people who created them. Even if the stories shift dramatically over time, those underlying references may remain consistent. These landmarks can guide researchers toward regions where archaeological remains might exist. In some cases, excavations inspired by traditional stories reveal ancient structures or artifacts that provide tangible evidence of earlier societies. This suggests that myths sometimes preserve the memory of places long after their physical traces become faint. The symbolic elements within myths do not always obscure their geographic origins. Even when a story takes on metaphorical meaning, the path described may still trace an ancient trade route or migration pattern. Communities often embed travel knowledge within storytelling, allowing future generations to understand how to move through their territory safely. As landscapes change, the practical meaning may fade, but the story remains. Researchers studying these patterns can sometimes reconstruct earlier routes by examining how certain narrative elements repeat across different versions of the same myth. Some myths contain hints about lost settlements or cultural centres. They may reference cities of remarkable size, hills shaped by human hands, or places where important events occurred. While the narrative details may be exaggerated or transformed, the geographical anchors often persist. The consistency of these descriptions across distant groups can indicate the former existence of shared cultural points. When archaeologists investigate such areas, they occasionally find evidence that communities once gathered or built structures there. The story becomes a map, highlighting locations that mattered before environmental or social changes made them difficult to see. There are also myths that describe connections between distant regions. These stories sometimes recount long journeys, alliances, or conflicts involving groups separated by great distances. While the accounts may not be literal, they can hint at ancient trade networks or cultural exchanges. Researchers comparing these stories with artifact distributions often find correlations. Items such as pottery, stones, or ornaments appear far from their origins, suggesting that people moved along routes reflected loosely in their narratives. The stories preserve a memory of connection, even if the original purpose of that connection is obscured. Some societies use myths to encode environmental knowledge. Stories about dangerous waters, unreliable seasons, or sacred groves may correspond to regions that posed practical challenges or offered valuable resources. These stories often include instructions or warnings delivered in symbolic form. When modern researchers decode these elements, they sometimes discover that the myth accurately reflects environmental patterns. This indicates that ancient communities built narratives around the realities of their surroundings. Over time, even as the details transformed, the spatial references within the story remained intact enough to guide interpretation. The preservation of memory within myth is not limited to environmental or geographical details. Many myths describe cultural practices, social structures, or technological skills in symbolic ways. When these stories mention tools, animals, or materials, they may reflect real aspects of daily life. These elements provide clues about how people interacted with their environment. Although myths are not literal histories, they blend memory with meaning. By studying narrative patterns, researchers can infer how earlier societies organized themselves or interpreted natural processes. These insights help fill gaps left by the archaeological record, which often captures physical remains but not the ideas that shape their use. A striking example of this appears in regions where stories describe cyclical destruction and renewal. Some myths recount periods when the land changed dramatically, prompting people to relocate or rebuild. While these stories often contain supernatural explanations, their underlying structure may reflect experiences with natural disasters or climate events. Archaeologists studying sediment layers in areas where such myths persist sometimes find evidence of floods, volcanic activity, or long droughts. The story preserves the memory of the event, even if the cultural interpretation differs from modern scientific understanding. Myths tied to ancestors or legendary leaders often preserve the memory of earlier population movements. Descriptions of migrations, battles, or alliances may appear symbolic, yet they can reflect actual shifts in settlement patterns. By comparing these stories across multiple groups, researchers can trace how different communities interacted or merged over time. Even when the details differ, recurring motifs suggest shared experiences. These patterns help identify regions where archaeological investigation might uncover additional evidence of movement or cultural exchange. Some stories preserve the memory of technologies or skills now lost. When myths describe tools with unusual properties or processes that no longer exist, they may reflect earlier knowledge systems. The symbolic language within the story can mask the technical details, but careful analysis sometimes reveals hints about metallurgical practices, construction techniques, or agricultural innovations. These hints encourage researchers to look for physical evidence that might otherwise be overlooked. In this way, stories become guides for interpreting scattered artifacts. The process by which myths preserve memory often involves simplification. Complex histories compress into narrative forms that are easier to remember. Names become symbolic, events merge, places transform into generalized settings. This compression does not eliminate all factual content, but it makes the original context more challenging to reconstruct. Researchers must balance caution with curiosity, recognizing that stories contain value even when their details do not align perfectly with physical evidence. Another factor in how myths map old worlds lies in their longevity. A story repeated regularly can survive for thousands of years, even as the environment shifts dramatically. Some myths describe coastlines that no longer exist, mountains that eroded long ago, or lakes that dried up. These descriptions provide clues about ancient landscapes. When compared with geological studies, they sometimes match past conditions with surprising accuracy. This suggests that stories can record memories of earlier worlds far older than the societies currently telling them. In some regions, myths describe encounters with groups or cultures that no longer exist. These stories may refer to former neighbours, trade partners, or rival communities. While the narrative elements may become exaggerated, they reflect real interactions. Researchers can use these stories to identify regions where evidence of contact might remain buried. The stories function as reminders that earlier societies interacted across wider networks than the archaeological record sometimes indicates. Myths can also reveal how people interpreted significant archaeological features long after their original purpose was forgotten. When communities encounter old structures without knowing who built them, they create stories to explain their origins. These stories may include giants, spirits, or legendary ancestors. While such accounts are not literal, they indicate that the structures were present and visible at the time the story formed. The myth preserves the memory of the ruins, connecting them to cultural identity in ways that archaeology alone cannot explain. Some narratives include detailed descriptions of journeys through regions that later became uninhabited or environmentally altered. These descriptions offer clues about ancient environments that no longer match present conditions. When researchers compare the stories with paleo-environmental data, they sometimes find correlations. This reinforces the idea that myths can preserve environmental memory across long spans of time. Even when symbolic elements dominate, the underlying geography remains embedded within the narrative. A different way myths function as maps involves their ability to organize space conceptually. Many societies divide the world into zones associated with different deities, spirits, or ancestral beings. These divisions often correspond to real landscapes. A story describing the domain of a particular figure may reflect a region with distinct environmental traits. When these conceptual maps align with patterns in the archaeological record, they help explain how people navigated their environment and understood territorial boundaries. Some myths describe ancient constructions, such as roads, walls, or massive earthworks. While these descriptions may exaggerate scale or purpose, they sometimes match real features that still exist. In areas where vegetation obscures the ground, these stories guide researchers toward possible excavation sites. The narrative memory becomes a tool for identifying structures hidden beneath soil or forest cover. Comparative mythology adds another layer of insight. When similar stories appear across distant societies, they may reflect shared experiences rooted in older cultural phases. These parallels help identify regions where ancient populations interacted or migrated. Even when the modern versions of the stories differ significantly, the shared structure can indicate a common origin. Archaeologists use these similarities to focus investigations in areas where physical evidence might be found. Researchers often treat myths carefully, recognizing that they are not straightforward histories. Yet dismissing them entirely risks overlooking valuable information preserved in narrative form. The challenge lies in interpreting them with an understanding of how memory changes across generations. By examining recurring elements, geographical references, and cultural patterns, researchers can extract insights that guide further study. These insights do not replace physical evidence but complement it, offering a broader picture of how people understood and inhabited their world. As techniques improve for analysing ancient environments, the correlation between myth and landscape becomes clearer. Sediment studies, pollen records, and isotopic analysis often confirm environmental conditions described in stories. These scientific findings provide a foundation for interpreting myths in a more informed way. The stories become clues, pointing toward landscapes long transformed or societies long gone. When myths map old worlds, they demonstrate how deeply human memory is tied to place. Even as details fade or transform, the core of a story can persist. People carry their understanding of the land forward, transmitting it through narratives that blend practicality with meaning. These stories become vessels that hold fragments of forgotten histories. They do not always reveal their full content, but they offer enough for researchers to sense the outlines of earlier worlds. Questions about who came before us often arise not from dramatic discoveries, but from the quiet recognition that the archaeological record preserves only a fraction of ancient life. Once people realize how many societies vanished without extensive traces, it becomes reasonable to wonder whether earlier civilizations existed that have not yet been identified or are no longer recognizable. This question does not imply advanced technology or unfamiliar beings. Instead, it invites consideration of how many human societies might have reached forms of organization, innovation, or cultural depth that time eventually erased. The possibility gains weight when researchers examine the gaps, the missing layers, and the limited preservation of earlier periods. These gaps leave room for interpretations that include societies older or structurally different from those currently documented. Understanding this possibility begins with acknowledging that the visible timeline of human complexity is shaped by uneven preservation. The earliest durable materials appear only after people began using methods that survive environmental conditions. Before this point, societies could have developed organized systems that simply did not leave lasting traces. The absence of evidence cannot be treated as evidence of absence. Instead, it reflects the limits of what survives long enough for researchers to detect. Groups that built with organic materials or used tools that degraded quickly may have lived sustainably for thousands of years without leaving recognizable ruins. One way to approach this question is by examining regions where the archaeological record shows long periods with little visible activity. Some researchers interpret these gaps as times when populations were sparse or technologically limited. Yet these gaps could also represent societies whose material signatures have not been preserved. Climate, soil acidity, and environmental disturbances can remove nearly all physical markers of human presence. When these conditions coincide with lifestyles that rely heavily on biodegradable materials, even large populations may remain archaeologically invisible. This invisibility opens the possibility that sophisticated groups existed without leaving the kinds of durable structures associated with later civilizations. There are also periods in which the archaeological record suggests abrupt transitions that may reflect earlier cultural phases not yet discovered. When certain regions suddenly show organized settlement patterns, agriculture, or social stratification, it raises the question of whether these developments arose independently or built upon earlier knowledge. If earlier phases relied on materials that did not survive, the visible emergence may appear sudden even if it was gradual. The possibility of older societies becomes stronger when researchers identify advanced knowledge appearing without clear developmental steps. Such patterns do not require extraordinary explanations. They simply suggest that earlier societies may have existed in forms the record did not preserve. Large-scale landscape modifications also contribute to this discussion. In several parts of the world, researchers have found evidence of ancient canals, terraces, or earthworks buried beneath multiple layers of sediment. These features sometimes lack associated artifacts or structures linking them to known cultures. Without clear dating or contextual information, researchers cannot always determine which groups created them. The absence of distinct cultural markers leaves open the chance that these features belong to societies predating those we typically associate with the region. As methods such as LIDAR and soil analysis continue to advance, more features of this kind appear, raising questions about their origins. Another reason to consider the possibility of earlier civilizations lies in the scale of environmental changes that occurred over tens of thousands of years. Coastlines shifted dramatically after the last ice age. Areas that once supported large populations now lie beneath the sea. Submerged landscapes along continental shelves hold evidence of human activity, yet only a small portion of these areas has been surveyed. It is entirely possible that older societies existed in these now submerged regions. Without extensive underwater archaeology, these possibilities remain open. The absence of surface evidence reflects access limitations rather than definitive conclusions. Some researchers point to patterns in genetic studies showing population expansions and migrations that do not always align neatly with the archaeological record. These genetic signatures indicate that groups moved across regions long before material evidence of their presence appears. The discrepancy suggests that those groups lived in ways that left few durable traces. Their cultural structures may have been more complex than the limited evidence suggests. The gap between genetic data and material remains supports the idea that earlier societies may have achieved forms of organization now hidden. Myths and oral histories, discussed earlier, also contribute to these considerations. When multiple distant cultures describe lost lands, great floods, or earlier peoples with distinct abilities, the stories could reflect memories of real societies that predate known civilizations. While the details in such stories are symbolic, they often contain consistent themes pointing toward environmental disruptions or population replacements. These narrative patterns suggest that earlier societies may have existed, but lost visibility through natural disasters or gradual environmental changes. One area of interest involves regions where climate would have been favourable to early societal development, but where archaeological remains are scarce. These regions may have supported large populations before shifts in climate made them less suitable for long-term habitation. When those populations moved, the original settlements may have decayed rapidly, especially if built with perishable materials. Later, environmental conditions may have erased what little remained. The lack of evidence does not imply the absence of earlier societies. It simply shows how easily the traces of those societies can disappear. Examining the timeline of human evolution also supports the possibility. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for over 300,000 years, yet clear evidence of large-scale organised societies appears only in the last portion of that timeline. This leaves long periods during which humans lived, adapted, and innovated without leaving behind extensive material traces. Given the cognitive abilities demonstrated by even the earliest known humans, it is reasonable to consider that earlier societies may have reached levels of cultural complexity not reflected in current findings. These societies might not fit modern definitions of civilization, but could still have been highly organised. Another factor involves the repeated resetting of human populations by climate events, volcanic eruptions, and other disruptions described earlier. Each reset may have erased prior cultural advancements. When populations decline sharply, knowledge systems can collapse. If these collapses occurred in societies without durable written records, their achievements would be nearly impossible to reconstruct. Archaeologists may find only the most basic remnants, which would not reflect the full extent of the society's capabilities. The possibility of earlier organised societies becomes more plausible when considering how many times human history has been interrupted by environmental events. Researchers sometimes uncover isolated artefacts that appear more advanced than the surrounding context suggests. These artefacts may belong to known cultures, but they also raise the question of whether earlier phases existed that the record does not preserve. While sensational interpretations are unnecessary, the presence of isolated artefacts demonstrates that technological innovation can appear in unexpected places. If earlier societies developed such tools but built primarily with materials that did not endure, their innovations may have faded without leaving a clear lineage. Considering the diversity of environments humans have occupied, it is likely that some societies developed in regions where archaeological preservation is particularly poor. Tropical climates, wetlands, and forested landscapes degrade materials quickly. Even stone can erode faster under certain conditions. Societies living in these regions may have established stable, organised communities without leaving behind structures capable of lasting thousands of years. As a result, these societies remain hypothetical until new evidence emerges. It is also possible that earlier societies existed in regions now covered by modern development. Urban expansion often obscures ancient layers, making excavation difficult. Some cities have been built repeatedly over millennia, compressing earlier societies beneath layers of construction. Unless extensive excavation occurs, these societies remain hidden. The possibility of earlier civilizations is therefore influenced by limited access to deeply buried layers in densely populated regions. In areas where researchers have conducted extensive surveys, discoveries often reveal more complexity than previously assumed. When LIDAR studies begin in a region previously considered low in archaeological potential, the results often show patterns of settlement, agriculture, or engineering not visible at ground level. This suggests that current interpretations of global ancient history may shift significantly as new technologies reveal hidden features. The potential for earlier societies grows with each discovery of unexpected complexity. The concept of earlier civilizations also depends on how civilization is defined. If the definition focuses strictly on monumental architecture, writing, and large urban centers, only a narrow range of societies will qualify. If the definition expands to include organized labor, cultural cohesion, sophisticated land management, or long-term societal planning, then many more societies may fit. This broader definition allows room for earlier civilizations that left minimal archaeological traces. Their achievements may not resemble those of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or later societies, but they still represent organized human endeavors. The question also arises when researchers find evidence of widespread trade networks predating known large-scale civilizations. If people traded materials across hundreds of miles long before documented states emerged, it implies that social structures existed to support such movement. These structures may have included leadership roles, travel knowledge, and cooperative agreements. Even if these networks did not create permanent settlements, they still reflect sophisticated cultural organisation. Earlier versions of such networks may have existed, but vanished entirely through environmental or cultural change. The possibility of earlier civilizations becomes clearer when considering how often human societies reorganize. A group may achieve a stable cultural form for thousands of years, then dissolve into smaller communities that leave behind minimal traces. Later groups may rebuild in new forms, creating the impression that civilization appeared suddenly without predecessors. Without direct evidence linking these phases, researchers cannot rule out the existence of earlier structured societies. The archaeological record captures only the last stable iterations, not the full chain of cultural development. In addition, early human dispersal across continents suggests that people adapted quickly to diverse environments. Such adaptability implies organizational abilities that may not be visible archaeologically. Societies that navigated oceans, crossed deserts, or adapted to extreme climates may have developed systems for cooperation, planning, and knowledge transmission. These abilities could support forms of civilization that do not match the visible remains of later agricultural societies. As research expands into regions once considered marginal, new evidence continues to emerge that challenges earlier assumptions. Each discovery reveals layers of human activity that were previously unknown. These findings do not confirm the existence of earlier civilizations in a dramatic sense, but they demonstrate that the archaeological record is far from complete. The gaps leave open the possibility that earlier societies existed in forms not yet uncovered. Trying to understand the past becomes a different kind of task when we accept that earlier worlds do not have the ability to describe themselves. Everything we learn about them depends on what survives long enough for us to interpret. The land holds fragments, but it does not provide direct explanations. Human memory, both personal and cultural, fades unless supported by stable communities. Written records appear only in certain times and places. Structures collapse, artifacts scatter. Many societies lacked materials that could endure, and many others experienced disruptions that erased their own histories. When we attempt to reconstruct these silent worlds, we do so with the awareness that the evidence available represents only a small portion of what once existed. Recognizing this changes the expectations placed on the archaeological record. Rather than assuming that the surviving pieces tell the full story, it becomes necessary to approach each fragment as part of a larger whole that cannot be recovered completely. This approach does not diminish the value of what remains. Instead, it acknowledges the limitations of reconstructing lives lived in environments that transformed repeatedly over thousands of years. The moment researchers examine a site, they face a world that cannot speak for itself. Their task becomes one of interpreting patterns, comparing variations, and asking questions that allow the physical traces to yield as much information as possible. Interpreting a silent world also means acknowledging how much human experience never becomes material in the first place. Traditions, beliefs, conversations, decisions, and shared understandings rarely leave behind physical markers. Even complex systems of knowledge may vanish if their carriers disappear or their environments change. The world cannot speak for these intangible elements, though their influence shaped how societies lived. This gap between lived experience and preserved evidence creates a challenge that cannot be fully resolved. Researchers attempt to fill it through comparison with similar societies, examination of geographical context, and careful analysis of whatever fragments do remain. As we consider the possibility that many civilizations once existed without leaving behind extensive evidence, the silence of the world becomes even more noticeable. The absence of certain kinds of artifacts does not necessarily reflect the absence of complex social structures. Instead, it may show how thoroughly nature reclaims the products of human activity. A group that built with wood, plant fibers, and soil could create stable settlements that dissolve fully within a few centuries. A community that used organic tools could develop sophisticated craftsmanship, but leave behind no durable remains. The The world holds no obligation to preserve any of this. It simply processes what is left within the rhythms of erosion, decay, and environmental change. This raises an important point about how researchers approach ancient landscapes. It becomes necessary to treat silence as evidence in itself. When a region lacks visible artifacts, the silence may indicate environmental factors that remove traces quickly. It may also indicate types of settlement that leave behind minimal remains. In both cases, the absence of material does not disprove the presence of earlier societies. Instead, the silence becomes a reminder that the world records history unevenly. Interpreting that unevenness requires a steady balance between caution and imagination, grounded in the understanding that history contains far more than the visible pieces. Recovery of forgotten worlds often begins when researchers identify small anomalies that hint at more extensive activity. A patch of soil enriched beyond natural levels, a pattern of stones arranged in a way that suggests intentional placement, a concentration of microscopic remains indicating repeated food preparation. These subtle signals form the basis for understanding societies that left behind no monumental architecture. The world may not speak, but it holds enough detail for careful study to reveal broader patterns. As these patterns accumulate, they contribute to a more complete picture of how people lived, adapted, and shaped their surroundings. Interpreting these hints requires patience. The world's silence does not reveal meaning quickly. Researchers must return to sites repeatedly, test hypotheses, and consider alternative explanations. Over time, the evidence forms a network of information that helps reconstruct aspects of earlier societies. Settlement sizes, population movements, and agricultural practices become clearer. Yet even with these details, the world remains mostly quiet about the personal aspects of life. The conversations held, the beliefs shared, the experiences that shaped identity. These elements do not fossilize. They exist only in the traces of how people organized space, used tools, and interacted with the environment. When approaching these challenges, researchers often draw on comparisons with societies whose histories are better preserved. The behaviors of known groups help interpret the fragmentary remains of unknown ones. This method is effective but also imperfect. No two societies develop identically, and similarities may mask differences. Even so, comparisons allow researchers to bridge some of the gaps the silent world leaves. They provide frameworks for understanding what kinds of activities might have occurred in areas where direct evidence is limited. As more discoveries accumulate, these frameworks adjust, creating more accurate interpretations over time. The silence of the world also shapes how we think about memory. When societies create traditions, they do so to connect themselves with their past. But traditions change, communities relocate, and languages evolve. A story once tied to specific events may drift into symbolism when its original context disappears. The world cannot preserve the shifting meanings behind these stories. It holds only faint material traces. Understanding how memory fades helps explain why the archaeological record contains so few clear narratives. Each artifact represents a moment, but the intentions behind that moment rarely survive. This fragile nature of memory influences how researchers approach silent landscapes. They must consider not only what the physical evidence shows, but also what it lacks. The absence of certain items may reflect cultural choices rather than limitations. A society might avoid permanent structures for practical reasons. It might prefer mobility or seasonal living. It might use materials that degrade quickly. These decisions shape the archaeological footprint in ways that require careful interpretation. Without understanding the diversity of human choices, the silence of the world can be misread as emptiness rather than the result of cultural variability. In some cases, the world reveals hints of forgotten societies through unexpected discoveries. A buried hearth, discovered beneath layers of sediment, a tool that appears older than surrounding artifacts, or a structure revealed by erosion can trigger new investigations. These discoveries sometimes reshape the understanding of entire regions. They show that the world holds memories even when it cannot express them directly. Each new find adds another piece to the larger puzzle, prompting further questions about the societies that once lived there. The quieter the evidence, the more researchers must rely on indirect methods to interpret it. Soil chemistry, pollen analysis, microscopic residue studies, and remote sensing technologies all help reveal patterns invisible to the naked eye. These methods allow researchers to detect agriculture, land management, and settlement organization even when traditional artifacts are scarce. The world remains silent about the specific people involved, but these scientific techniques make it possible to infer broader cultural behaviors. As these methods improve, previously overlooked landscapes become sources of new information. Another challenge arises when interpreting sites that experienced repeated habitation. Later populations often reuse earlier locations, altering or removing the traces left by previous societies. The silent world of the past becomes layered beneath newer activity. Each layer reveals only a portion of its original structure. Later disturbances distort the context needed for full interpretation. Researchers must disentangle these layers carefully, recognizing that the silence of the earliest layers may be the result of later modifications rather than an absence of initial activity. Understanding a silent world also requires thinking about the scale of time. A structure might appear ruined today, yet in the past it may have stood solidly for hundreds of years. A settlement might appear small by modern standards, yet at the time it could have supported a thriving community. The world preserves evidence on a scale that compresses centuries into thin layers of soil. Without acknowledging these timescales, interpretations risk underestimating the significance of the remains. The world's silence results partly from how much time has passed and how many processes have altered the original sites. Cultural practices also shape how silent a world becomes. Some groups maintained elaborate burial traditions, producing graves that remain visible for millennia. Others followed practices that left few recognizable markers. The absence of burial evidence does not indicate the absence of ritual or belief. It simply means that the chosen methods did not preserve well. Similarly, some societies produced abundant pottery, while others relied on containers made from organic material. The presence of pottery makes a society easier to study. The absence does not imply lower complexity. It indicates that the material record reflects only a narrow spectrum of human choices. A silent world also challenges modern assumptions about what constitutes civilization. The traditional markers, cities, writing, monumental architecture, represent only one type of societal development. Many societies organized themselves in ways that left minimal traces. Their achievements lie in land management, sustainable practices, or cultural cohesion rather than durable structures. The world does not speak these achievements aloud. Researchers must interpret subtle patterns to uncover them. This understanding broadens the definition of civilization and encourages a more inclusive view of human history. Interacting with a world that cannot speak requires recognizing that some questions may remain unanswered. This does not diminish the value of inquiry. It highlights the importance of careful observation, scientific rigor, and openness to new possibilities. When researchers accept the limitations of the record, they can focus on constructing the most accurate interpretations possible without overstating conclusions. The silent world continues to reveal new insights as methods improve and new sites are explored. Examining the silence also changes how we think about our own place in history. The lives of earlier societies may appear distant, yet they face challenges and made decisions shaped by their environments in ways that mirror our own experiences. Their silence reminds us that future generations may know little of our daily lives. Only certain items will endure, only fragments will remain. This perspective encourages reflection on how memory functions within civilizations and how easily it can fade. One of the most meaningful aspects of studying silent worlds lies in the recognition that their stories become visible only through sustained effort. Researchers devote years to understanding a site, assembling clues that remain quiet until interpreted carefully. This process reveals not only the details of ancient life, but also the dedication required to uncover them. The world may not speak, but it holds more than enough information for those willing to listen through patient investigation. Even when silence dominates, the physical traces that do remain help anchor the understanding of broader human patterns. They demonstrate adaptation, resilience, creativity, and variation across time and space. By examining these traces, researchers gain insight into the diverse ways people responded to their environments. The silent world becomes less mysterious as each new discovery adds depth to the understanding of how societies lived and changed.